She handed him a microphone in front of 500 of the wealthiest people in Texas and told him to start a dead car or walk away humiliated. He was a grease-stained nobody with $11 in his checking account and a 9-year-old daughter waiting at home. What happened next silenced every person in that auction hall and eventually brought down a billion-dollar empire built on 60 years of lies. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel delivers stories that stay with you long after they're over. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you love a good underdog tale, tap that like button before we go any further. Now, let's get into it. The auction tent had been erected on the grounds of the Beaumont estate just outside of Fort Worth, and by 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning in late October, it already smelled like old money and fresh arrogance. Valets in pressed white shirts directed a parade of vehicles that cost more than most people made in 5 years. Matte black Bentleys, polished McLarens, a silver Rolls-Royce that caught the morning sun like a mirror. The guests who stepped out of those cars wore watches that didn't need to keep accurate time because their owners had long since stopped caring about schedules. They arrived at events like this one the way most people check their mailboxes, casually, expectantly, already certain they deserved whatever was inside. Landon Pierce arrived in a 2009 Chevy pickup with a cracked passenger side mirror, a check engine light he'd been ignoring since August, and a travel mug of gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere on I-30. He parked at the far edge of the overflow lot, between a landscaping trailer and a portable toilet, because that was the only space left that didn't require a valet ticket he couldn't afford to tip for. He sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. Not because he was nervous, or maybe a little, if he was honest, but because he was trying to remember exactly why he'd driven 2 hours and 20 minutes to attend an auction where the opening bid on most items started at $40,000. The catalog. That was why. He reached into the glove compartment, past a water-stained owner's manual, past a folded drawing Ava had made him of the two of them standing in front of a Pierce's Garage sign she'd spelled with a backwards R, and found the printed auction listing he'd folded in half and then in half again until the edges were soft. Lot 47. Description: red dragster, non-operational, sold as is. Estimated value: $500. No reserve. He'd found it 3 weeks earlier while scrolling through the Beaumont estate pre-auction listings at midnight, sitting at his workbench after Ava had gone to sleep. He almost scrolled past it. He almost scrolled past the thing that mattered most. But something made him stop. It was the photograph. A single image, badly lit, taken at what looked like an odd angle, as if the photographer had held the camera sideways by accident or simply didn't care. The car sat under a canvas tarp that had been partially pulled back to reveal the nose and the driver's compartment. Even in the bad light, even half-covered, even coated in what appeared to be decades of grime, the lines of the body stopped Landon cold. He'd leaned closer to the screen. The body was hand-formed. He could see it in the way the metal contoured. Not stamped, not cast from a production mold, but shaped by human hands. Somebody had beaten that body into existence panel by panel, and whoever they were, they had known exactly what they were doing. The proportions were wrong for anything he recognized from standard production history, which meant it was either a custom build or a one-off prototype. Either way, it didn't belong in a junk lot. He'd spent the following 3 weeks doing research between oil changes and transmission flushes, searching through old racing magazines he'd found in boxes at estate sales over the years, cross-referencing body styles, wheelbase measurements, cockpit configurations. He hadn't found an exact match. What he'd found instead was a feeling he hadn't trusted in a long time. The feeling that something was worth chasing even when you couldn't fully explain why. So he'd driven 2 hours and 20 minutes to Fort Worth, because he was either right about the car or he'd wasted a Saturday and a tank of gas. Both of those outcomes seemed survivable. He checked in at the registration table, collected his bidder paddle, number 74, and walked into the main tent. The space was enormous, climate-controlled to a degree that felt aggressively deliberate, given that it was 62 degrees outside. Long rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where items would be presented. Around the perimeter, display pedestals held the highlight vehicles. A 1968 Mustang Shelby GT500 that had been restored to within an inch of its life, a pair of matching Lamborghinis that were apparently from the same private collection, and a 1971 Ferrari dyno that wore its original paint like a badge of honor. Landon moved through the crowd with his catalog open, making small course corrections around people who weren't watching where they were going because they were accustomed to other people getting out of their way. He was wearing his cleanest pair of dark jeans, a button-down flannel he'd ironed that morning on Ava's insistence. "Dad, you have to iron it. It has lines in it." And boots that were polished but still clearly work boots. He looked exactly like what he was, a working man who had shown up somewhere he didn't quite fit. He was trying to find Lot 47 in the pre-display area when he nearly walked into her. He didn't know who she was at first. That was important, because if he'd known, he might have handled the next 90 seconds differently. She was standing with two other people, a man in a suit who appeared to be actively taking notes on a tablet, and a woman in a blazer who held a coffee the way powerful people held things, loosely, like it would hold itself if she let go. The woman Landon nearly walked into was around 30, maybe a year or two on either side. Dark hair pulled back, suit that probably cost more than his truck. Eyes that moved across the room like she was calculating the value of every object in it, including the people. "Sorry," Landon said, stepping back. She looked at him the way people look at a door they've almost walked into, noting the obstacle, already moving on. "The pre-display vehicles are along the east wall," she said, as if he'd asked for directions. "Flagged lots are in the annex." "I know where I'm going," he said. Not rude, just factual. She looked at him for a half-second longer than necessary, and then her attention returned to whatever her assistant was showing her on the tablet. Landon kept moving. He found Lot 47 in the far corner of the annex tent, which was a smaller, significantly less air-conditioned space where items that didn't fit in the main display had been stored. Most of the lots in here were boxes of automotive parts, a couple of non-running motorcycles, and what appeared to be the dismantled interior of a 1940s-era bus. The dragster sat at the back, still mostly covered by its tarp, and it had not been treated with any particular respect. Someone had stacked a box of miscellaneous spark plugs on the rear wing. Landon moved the spark plugs off the wing and set them on the ground. Then he pulled back the tarp. The car was red, or had been, once. The paint had oxidized in patches, and there were areas along the nose and down the driver's side where the surface had dulled to something closer to rust orange. The cockpit was open, the roll cage intact, and the seat, a custom-fitted bucket that had clearly been made for a specific human body, was cracked along the right bolster but otherwise holding together. The engine was covered, and the cover was latched with a simple wire clasp. Landon crouched down and ran one hand along the left side of the body just below the cockpit sill. The metal was thicker than it looked. Real thickness, not the artificial rigidity of modern manufacturing. And the forming, the way the skin of the car curved from the nose back into the flanks and then swept upward toward the tail, was unlike anything he'd seen in production. The radius on the wheel arch was hand-blended. He could see the subtlety in it, the slight variation that you only got when a human being worked the metal directly. He unlocked the engine cover clasp and lifted it. The engine was buried under a substantial accumulation of age, surface oxidation on the block, cracked rubber on visible hose connections, a fuel line that had stiffened to the point of brittleness in at least one place he could see. But the block itself, the fundamental architecture of the thing, was intact. More than intact. It was extraordinary. The displacement was unusual. The intake manifold was custom fabricated, not a modified production unit, but something that had been machined from scratch. The valve covers were hand-engraved with a pattern he couldn't fully make out under the grime. And the throttle linkage. He leaned in closer. The throttle body was connected via a linkage system he had never seen before. Not a cable pull, not a standard mechanical connection, but a precision-articulated mechanical system that used 3 pivot points in a geometry he'd never encountered in 60 years of documented racing engineering. He sat back on his heels and looked at the engine for a long moment. Then he closed the cover, replaced the tarp, and went to find a quiet corner to think. The auction started at 10 o'clock, with the kind of practiced theatrical energy that expensive events use to disguise the fact that they are, at their core, about people competing to own things. The auctioneer was a man named Gerald, who wore a bolo tie and spoke at a pace that suggested he'd done this so many times, the words had smoothed themselves into a single continuous sound. The highlight vehicles went first, and they went fast. The Shelby hit 640,000. The Ferrari went to a phone bidder at just under $1 million. The room responded to each sale with the contained enthusiasm of people who were impressed but not surprised, because nothing in a room like this was supposed to be surprising. Surprise was for people who didn't have enough money to anticipate what they could afford. Landon held his paddle and waited. He was on his third page of calculations on the back of his catalog when Lot 47 was announced. Lot 47, Gerald said, red dragster, non-operational, sold as is, no warranty expressed or implied, buyer responsible for transportation, opening bid $500. There was a murmur in the room, not the murmur of interest, the murmur of mild collective amusement that this item had been included at all. The dragster was wheeled out on a dolly by 2 lot attendants. The tarp had been removed, and under the auction tent's bright lighting, the car looked significantly worse than it had in the annex. The oxidized paint, the cracked seat, the general air of profound abandonment, all of it was more visible now, presented to an audience that spent the kind of money that made anything looking this bad seem almost comical. Someone in the third row laughed. Not loudly, just a small, private, expensive laugh. Landon raised his paddle. 500, thank you. Bidder, 74. Gerald's eyes moved across the room. Do I have 6? Silence. 550? More silence. Then from the elevated platform along the side of the room where VIP attendees were seated, a voice cut through the quiet. I'll pay you to take it away. The room laughed. Not a small laugh this time, a real one. A collective release of amusement, the kind that happens when someone with authority decides something is funny. Landon turned toward the voice. It was the woman from earlier, the one he'd almost walked into. She was seated in the front row of the VIP section with the tablet man and the blazer woman flanking her. She was looking at the dragster with an expression of mild contempt, the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they find ugly but not threatening. Ladies and gentlemen, Gerald said, recovering smoothly. For those who may not know, we are honored to have with us today Ms. Vivienne Sterling, CEO of Sterling Automotive. Sterling Automotive. The name landed on Landon like a stone dropped in still water. He knew the name. Every person in the automotive world knew the name. Sterling Automotive was one of the largest independent automotive companies in the country. Luxury vehicles, performance components, a research and development division that had produced 3 patents in the last decade that had changed how fuel injection systems were designed. Vivienne Sterling had taken over from her grandfather's estate at 26 and had spent the last 4 years turning an already powerful company into something genuinely formidable. She was also, apparently, the kind of person who made jokes at auctions. Ms. Sterling, Gerald said with a smile that had done a lot of work over many years. Shall we assume you're not bidding on Lot 47? On that? She tilted her head slightly. I wouldn't know where to begin. It doesn't run, it never will, and whoever built it clearly had no idea what they were doing. She looked at the car the way she'd looked at Landon, not with hostility, but with the particular dismissiveness of someone who has never once considered that they might be wrong. But if our friend with paddle 74 wants it, maybe he can find something useful to do with the scrap. The room chuckled again. Landon did not move. He sat very still with his paddle in his lap and looked at Vivienne Sterling, and he thought about the throttle linkage he'd seen under that engine cover, and he thought about the hand-formed body, and he thought about Ava's drawing with the backwards R. Then Gerald said, Going once at 500 to bidder 74? Actually, Vivienne Sterling's voice cut through again. She was looking directly at Landon now, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite cruelty, but wasn't far from it. It was the look of someone who had decided to make a moment out of something small. Let's make this interesting. Gerald paused. The room shifted forward slightly. If you can start it, Vivienne said, addressing Landon directly, I'll buy it from you on the spot. Whatever you want for it. Within reason. A pause, and then, with perfect timing, of course it won't start, but the offer stands. The room was very quiet. What do you say? She asked. And she smiled, not unkindly, but with the full confidence of someone who already knew the answer. Landon looked at her for a moment, Then he looked at the car. Then he said, "Give me 20 minutes." The reaction was not what he expected. He'd expected more laughter, the room finishing the joke she'd started. Instead, there was a murmur of something more complicated. Not belief exactly, more like the communal holding of breath that happens when someone does something unexpected, and the room hasn't yet decided whether to applaud or wince. Gerald covered the pause professionally. "Well then, we'll take a brief recess, ladies and gentlemen, and return for lot 48 in approximately 20 minutes. Refreshments are available along the north side of the tent." The crowd began to move and murmur. A few people drifted toward the dragster with the casual interest of spectators who wanted to be near something without being part of it. Vivienne Sterling remained where she was, watching. Landon walked to the car. He did not run. He did not look around at the crowd. He pulled his multi-tool from his belt. He carried it out of habit the same way other people carried pens. And he crouched down beside the engine compartment and began to work. A man in an expensive blazer appeared at his shoulder. "You know it's not going to start, right? I've been in this business 30 years and that thing is, I need some room," Landon said. The man stepped back, more from surprise than compliance. Landon blocked out the crowd. He'd learned how to do that in his father's shop when he was 11 years old, learning to diagnose problems in the middle of noise and heat and the constant pressure of customers waiting. His father had told him once, "The car will tell you what's wrong if you stop listening to everything else." His father had been a difficult man in a lot of ways, had been absent in ways that still ached sometimes when Landon wasn't careful. But he'd been right about that. He opened the engine cover. Working from observation rather than assumption, he traced the fuel system from the tank connection forward. The feed line had hardened where he'd seen it from the outside, and there was a section near the connection to the mechanical fuel pump where the line had cracked. Not completely, but enough to draw air and break the siphon. He needed a replacement section, or a seal. He looked it around. "Does anyone have a length of fuel-compatible hose?" he asked, without particular urgency. "Quarter-inch interior diameter. 6 inches would do it." Silence. Then a voice from the edge of the crowd. "I've got a patch kit in my truck. I restore classics on weekends." Landon looked up. A man in his 60s, weathered face, NASCAR hat, comfortable in his jeans in a way that most of the people in this tent were not. He held up a small kit. "That'll work," Landon said. "Thank you." The man pushed through the ring of observers and handed it over. "You really think you can get it going?" "I think someone already did the hard work," Landon said, and turned back to the engine. The fuel line repair took 9 minutes, not because the job was complicated, but because he worked carefully. In an environment like this, with people watching, the temptation was to hurry, and hurrying was how good mechanics made expensive mistakes. He replaced the cracked section, checked the connection at both ends, and tested the draw by hand before moving on. The ignition wiring was next. 2 leads had separated at the firewall, age-related deterioration, not damage, and he reconnected them with the wire connectors from the patch kit, which had more in it than just hose material. The spark plugs were visually intact from what he could see without pulling them, which left the timing, the compression, and the carburetor as variables he couldn't fully address in the remaining minutes. Except, he stopped. He had been working so methodically through the obvious issues that he'd nearly missed the thing that wasn't obvious. The throttle linkage, the geometry he hadn't recognized earlier. He looked at it again now with fresh eyes, and something about the way the mechanism was positioned relative to the carburetor inlet made him set down his tool and simply look. The linkage wasn't just unusual in its geometry, it was attached to something secondary. Below the carburetor, half hidden behind the primary fuel connection, there was a small secondary chamber, not part of any carburetor design he knew, connected to the intake via a narrow passage. The chamber had its own adjustment screw, currently seized from decades of non-use, and a small priming port. This wasn't a modified production system. This was a different kind of system entirely. Landon sat back and looked at the engine for a full 10 seconds without touching anything. Then he pulled out his multi-tool, selected the smallest flathead bit, and very carefully applied penetrating pressure to the adjustment screw. It moved. Not easily, but it moved, rotating a quarter turn before it stopped. A quarter turn was enough to open the secondary passage. He used a small squeeze of primer fluid from the patch kit to charge the port, replaced the priming cap, and stood up. Is there a battery we can use? He called out. 12-volt, anything. The NASCAR hat man was already moving. He jogged out of the tent and came back 3 minutes later with a portable jump battery from his own truck. Landon connected it. He checked the connections twice. Then he looked at the cockpit. There was something under the driver's seat. He'd noticed it peripherally while working near the firewall. A shape that didn't match the structural tubing of the roll cage. A small bundle secured with what looked like a leather strap. He hadn't reached for it yet. The crowd was watching, the time was running short, and it wasn't relevant to getting the engine started. But it was there, and something about it made his hand want to reach for it more than anything else in this entire morning. He left it. For now. He climbed into the cockpit, or more precisely, lowered himself into it, because the cockpit was fitted tight, and he was not a small man. The seat held him in a way that felt specific, shaped for a body close to his own height, slightly narrower in the shoulders. Whoever had driven this car, they had been around 6 feet, medium build. He found the ignition switch, original, a toggle type, on the left side of the dash panel. He checked the throttle response by hand. It was stiff but present. He looked out at the crowd. There were perhaps 200 people watching now. The others who drifted to the refreshment table had come back. Vivienne Sterling had not moved from her seat. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, not the comfortable confidence from before. Something else, something more careful. Landon set his hand on the ignition switch. He thought briefly about the $11 in his checking account. He thought about Ava's drawing with the backwards R. He thought about his father's shop, the smell of it, the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when an engine that wasn't supposed to start started. He flipped the switch. The engine turned over. It coughed once, a hard, deep mechanical cough that sent a visible shudder through the car's body. Then it caught, and it caught hard. And the sound that came out of the Crimson Phantom after 60 years of silence was not a polite sound. It was not the refined purr of a restored classic. It was a sound like controlled violence, a deep, ragged, enormous roar that seemed to expand the air inside the tent, that hit people in their chests before it hit their ears. The man with the NASCAR hat took a step backward. He put his hand over his mouth. 2 women near the aisle grabbed each other's arms. Landon sat in the cockpit with the engine running and his hands resting in his lap, and he let it run. He didn't rev it. The fuel system was still in questionable shape, and he wasn't going to push it. He just let it idle, steady, and deep, the way a living thing breathes when it's been still for a very long time. He looked at Vivienne Sterling. She was on her feet. She was the only person in the VIP section who was standing, and she didn't appear to know she'd stood up. Her tablet man was saying something to her, and she wasn't responding. She was looking at the dragster, not at Landon, at the car, with an expression that had evacuated itself of everything it had contained before. She looked, for the first time since he'd seen her, like someone who was not entirely sure of what was happening. Landon let the engine run for another 30 seconds. Then he reached forward and shut it down. The silence that followed was one of those silences that has physical weight. Gerald, the auctioneer, had come back to his podium. He stood there with his microphone and did not say anything for a full 3 seconds, which for a professional auctioneer was essentially an eternity. Then, well, someone started clapping, then more people. It built quickly, the way applause does when a room has been holding something back and finally has permission to release it. Landon climbed out of the cockpit, not gracefully. His left knee caught on the roll cage on the way up, and stood beside the car. He didn't take a bow. He didn't raise his fist or do anything performative. He just stood there, slightly sweaty, with grease under his fingernails that the morning had put there, and he looked at Vivienne Sterling. She walked down from the VIP platform. The crowd parted for her the way it would for anyone who moved with that kind of certainty, even when the certainty had something new underneath it. She stopped 6 feet away from him. "You started it," she said. "You said 20 minutes. He glanced at his watch. "I had 4 left. She looked at the car, then back at him. "That wasn't supposed to be possible." "Most things are possible if you know what you're looking at." There was a pause. Around them, people were murmuring, taking out phones. The event had become something other than what it was supposed to be. Vivienne Sterling's expression moved through several things quickly. Calculation, something that might have been anger, and then something much harder to name. "The offer stands," she said finally. "What do you want for it?" Landon looked at her for a moment. "I don't know yet what I have. I'm not selling anything I don't understand." Her eyes sharpened. "It's a 60-year-old scrap car." "No," Landon said, "it's not." And then, before either of them could say anything else, he turned back to the car, crouched down beside the driver's seat, and reached underneath it. His hand found the leather strap. He unbuckled it, carefully, and withdrew a small metal component, roughly the size of a deck of cards, wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied at both ends with wire. It was heavy for its size. He turned it over in his hands and unwrapped one end of the oilcloth just enough to see the surface. It was a throttle component, machined from what looked like aircraft-grade aluminum, and engraved along one face, in letters so precise they might have been cut by a machine, but bore the slight variation of a human hand, were two words: Silas Rowan. Landon stared at the engraving for a long moment. He had done enough research to recognize the architecture of this engine. He had spent 3 weeks trying to find the source of what he'd seen in that photograph. He hadn't found a name, but he had a name now. He carefully rewrapped the oilcloth and stood up. He held the component against his chest the way you hold something you know is important before you know exactly why. He looked at Vivienne Sterling one more time. Her face had gone very still. She recognized the name. He could see it immediately, in the way her expression locked. Not closed exactly, but contained, the way a door closes on a room you don't want anyone else to see inside. She knew who Silas Rowan was. Landon filed that away. He said nothing. He turned to Gerald, who was standing nearby looking as though he was trying to remember how professional he was supposed to be. "I'll take the car," Landon said. "I believe the opening bid was $500. "Yes," Gerald said. "Yes, it was. Sold." Later, after the arrangements had been made and the flatbed had been called and the paperwork signed, Landon sat in his truck in the overflow lot and drank the last of his cold gas station coffee. His hands were still faintly shaking, which they sometimes did after a problem resolved itself, like the nervous system catching up to what had already happened. He looked at the oilcloth package on the seat beside him. Silas Rowan. He pulled out his phone and typed the name into a search engine. The first result loaded slowly on the lot's weak Wi-Fi signal. Then the page appeared. It was a short article from a trade magazine published in 1963, one of those pieces that had been scanned and uploaded decades later by a preservation project. The headline read, "Independent engineer Silas Rowan claims revolutionary fuel delivery breakthrough, industry skeptical." The article was short, 3 paragraphs. It mentioned a small racing team in West Texas, an engineer named Silas Rowan and his racing partner, a prototype vehicle, and a fuel delivery system that Rowan claimed could increase efficiency by a margin that the industry had called impossible. There was a photograph. It was grainy, black and white, poorly reproduced from the original print. But the car in the photograph, sitting in what appeared to be a workshop, surrounded by tools and men in work clothes, and the specific focused energy of people who were building something they believed in, was unmistakably the car on the flatbed pulling into the lot behind him. Landon sat with that for a while. Then he folded the oilcloth into his jacket pocket, started the truck, and drove home to his daughter. The drive back to Mineral Wells took 2 hours and 17 minutes, and Landon spent most of it in the particular silence that follows a day that doesn't make complete sense yet. The flatbed carrying the dragster was somewhere behind him. He'd arranged for it to be delivered to his shop by Monday morning, and the oilcloth package was in his jacket pocket, pressing against his ribs with every breath like a reminder that he hadn't imagined any of it. He stopped at a gas station outside of Weatherford, filled the truck, and called Ava. She picked up on the second ring. "Did you get it?" "Yeah," he said. "I got it." "Is it cool?" He looked out the windshield at the flat Texas landscape going amber in the late afternoon light. "Yeah, baby, it's pretty cool. Mrs. Delgado let me stay for dinner. We had tamales. She said you have to bring me back tomorrow so she can show me how to make the red sauce." "That's fine." "Dad." A pause. "You sound weird." "I'm just tired. I'll be home by 8. Don't stay up." "I'm 9, not a baby." 8:30 then. Go eat your tamales." He heard her laugh before she hung up. A short, uncomplicated sound that cut through whatever had been sitting on his chest since the auction tent. And he stood there at the pump for a moment longer than necessary before getting back in the truck. The name in his pocket was Silas Rowan, And the article had been from 1963, and the car was real, and Vivienne Sterling had recognized the name immediately. He didn't know yet what any of that meant in the order it needed to mean things, but he knew the shape of a puzzle when he'd found one, and he knew the feeling of pulling a thread that had more attached to it than you'd expected. He drove the rest of the way home in the dark. His shop was a converted two-bay garage on the south edge of town that he'd been renting for 6 years, long enough that the landlord, a retired cotton farmer named Harold Betts, had stopped charging him the full rate somewhere around year 4 without either of them formally acknowledging it. The apartment above the shop was small, in the way that small apartments are when they're occupied by someone who fills the space with tools and books and a child's drawings taped to the refrigerator. It was cluttered and imperfect, and it was home in the specific way that places become home when you've had nowhere else to go. Landon brought the oilcloth package upstairs and set it on the kitchen table. He made coffee, real coffee this time, not gas station, and sat down and unwrapped it fully. The throttle component was more extraordinary in full light than it had been in the partial unveiling at the auction. It was roughly rectangular, machined from a single billet of what he was now almost certain was aerospace-grade aluminum, not the alloy used in production automotive components. The edges were chamfered with a precision that would have required specialized tooling. The internal passages, he could see the inlet and outlet ports, were in a configuration he couldn't immediately diagram in his head. And across the face, the engraving, Silas Rowan. Below the name, a small symbol, 2 overlapping circles, like a Venn diagram, with what appeared to be a letter inside each one. The left circle contained an S. The right contained an R. His initials, and possibly someone else's. Landon photographed the component from 6 angles with his phone, then set it carefully aside and opened his laptop. He'd found the 1963 Trade magazine article through a basic search. What he found when he went deeper took him past midnight. Silas Rowan had not been a well-known figure even in his own time. He appeared in racing circuit records from the late 1950s through the early 1960s as the chief mechanic and engineer for a small independent team that raced in regional drag events across West Texas and eastern New Mexico. The team's driver and co-owner was a man named Carter Briggs, and together they had apparently been something of a local phenomenon in the circuits they ran. Winning enough to be noticed, but operating outside the major sanctioned events where the real attention lived. The Trade magazine article from 1963 was the most substantial piece of press either man had ever received. It described Rowan's development of what the article called a secondary fuel induction system that allegedly improved combustion efficiency through a method the article didn't fully explain, probably because the journalist hadn't fully understood it. What was clear was that Rowan had claimed the system was revolutionary. The racing establishment had been skeptical, and both Rowan and Briggs had apparently declined several approaches from larger automotive interests who wanted to acquire the technology. After 1963, Silas Rowan essentially disappeared from the record. There were no further articles, no race results, no patents filed, no obituary that Landon could locate with any reasonable search. Carter Briggs appeared in a brief mention in a 1965 compilation of regional racing casualties, a fire, the mention said, at a private workshop outside of Odessa, Texas. 1 fatality. The workshop was uninsured, the cause listed as undetermined. Landon sat with that for a while. 1 fatality, undetermined cause, 1965. 2 years after the only article about a fuel delivery system that someone had built into the engine of the car currently on its way to his shop. He closed the laptop. He looked at the oilcloth component on the kitchen table, at the 2 overlapping circles and the letters inside them. S for Silas, and maybe R for Rowan, or maybe R for something else entirely. Then he thought about Vivienne Sterling's face when he'd held up the component at the auction, the way her expression had locked, the door closing on the room she didn't want anyone to see. He went to bed at 1:15 in the morning and did not sleep particularly well. The flatbed arrived Monday at 7:45 before Ava had left for school. She came down from the apartment in her backpack and stood in the shop doorway watching the dragster get rolled off the lowered bed, and she was quiet in the way she was sometimes quiet when something was working on her. "That's it?" she said finally. "That's it." She looked at the oxidized red paint, the cracked seat, the general appearance of a machine that had been very thoroughly forgotten. "It looks kind of sad." "Yeah," Landon said. "It does." "Are you going to fix it?" I'm going to figure out what it is first. She looked at him. She had his eyes, dark and direct, and she'd developed at 9 the habit of using them to evaluate whether the adults around her were being fully honest. Is it something important? He considered the question. Might be. Okay. She hitched her backpack up. Don't forget I have library club on Thursday. I know. You forgot last time. I showed up. 20 minutes late. Mrs. Flores gave me a look. I'll be on time Thursday. She held his gaze for another half second, apparently decided this was as solid a guarantee as she was going to get, and walked to school. Landon turned back to the dragster. He spent the first 3 days of that week doing something that most mechanics in his situation would not have done. He documented before he touched anything. He photographed every panel, every component, every wire routing and connection point. He measured the wheelbase, the track width, the cockpit dimensions, the engine bay clearances. He sketched, by hand, the configuration of the throttle linkage and the secondary induction system he'd identified at the auction, and he cross-referenced his sketches against every technical diagram he had in his reference collection, which was substantial, accumulated over 20 years of professional practice and a personal obsession with pre-1970s performance engineering. The secondary induction system did not match anything in his references, not even approximately. By Wednesday evening, he had a working theory about what it was. By Thursday afternoon, after Ava's library club that he attended 11 minutes late despite his intentions, he was fairly certain the theory was right. By Friday morning, he was certain enough to make a phone call he'd been putting off because he wasn't sure how to start it. He called Dale Whitmore, who had taught automotive engineering at Texas A&M for 30 years, and who Landon had met 7 years ago when Dale had brought a 1962 Shelby prototype into the shop with a transmission problem and had stayed for 4 hours because he'd been fascinated by the way Landon's diagnostic process worked. Landon Pierce, Dale said. He had the voice of a man who had spent decades projecting to classrooms. Haven't heard from you in, 2 years? Thereabouts? I need a second opinion on something. What kind of something? I found an engine I can't identify. A pause. You can't identify an engine. You once told me what was wrong with a vehicle by listening to it run through the phone. I know what's wrong with it. I need someone to confirm what's right with it. Landon paused. It's got a secondary induction system that I've never seen before. Custom fabricated. Integrated into the throttle body in a way that doesn't match any production architecture I can find. The silence on Dale's end was of a different quality now. Where did you find this? At an auction, listed as a junk vehicle. What kind of vehicle? Dragster, probably late 50s, early 60s construction. Hand-formed body. The engine block is non-standard displacement, the intake manifold is custom fabricated, and the throttle linkage runs a 3-pivot articulated system that I've never seen documented anywhere. Landon looked at his sketches on the workbench. The throttle component has a name engraved on it, Silas Rowan. The silence was longer this time. Dale. I heard you. Another pause. Where are you? Mineral Wells. I can be there Saturday morning. Landon blinked. Dale lived in College Station, which was 3 hours from Mineral Wells. You don't have to drive out here. Landon. Dale's voice had changed. Not alarmed exactly, but focused in a way that was slightly different from his usual professorial deliberateness. If that engraving says what you're saying it says, and if the system is what you're describing, drive out there yourself, close your shop, and don't talk to anybody else about this until I've seen it. Landon was quiet for a moment. You know who Silas Rowan is? I know what he was working on, Dale said. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Don't let anyone else look at that engine. He hung up. Landon set his phone on the workbench and looked at the dragster. He'd moved it into the back bay and covered it with a clean drop cloth. He'd installed a new deadbolt on the back bay door on Tuesday, which he'd told himself was just good practice for a secured workspace, and which had nothing to do with the vague unease he'd been carrying since the auction. He was a mechanic in Mineral Wells, Texas. Nobody was paying attention to him or his new acquisition, except that Vivienne Sterling had given her assistant his bidder registration information before Landon had even left the auction tent. He'd seen the assistant photographing his paperwork from across the table when he'd thought Landon wasn't looking. He'd noted it and said nothing. People like Vivienne Sterling collected information the way other people collected things they might need someday. It was probably nothing. He went upstairs, helped Ava with a math worksheet that had a section on fractions that she was approaching with the specific hostility she reserved for things she found unfair, and made them both grilled cheese sandwiches because it was Friday, and grilled cheese was the Friday rule they'd arrived at by unanimous vote of everyone in the household, which was just the two of them. "Dad," Ava said, around a mouthful of sandwich. "What was the car guy's name again? The one on the part?" He looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "I heard you on the phone this morning. You didn't close the shop door all the way." She chewed. "Silas something." "Silas Rowan." "Did you find him?" "I'm working on it." She nodded, processing this the way she processed information, by temporarily setting it aside to return to later. "Is he still alive?" "I don't know yet." "If he is, he'd be really old." "Yeah, he would." She finished her sandwich. "You should find him," she said. "If someone made something and nobody remembers it, that seems like the worst kind of being forgotten, worse than regular forgotten." Landon looked at his daughter for a moment. She had a way of arriving at the center of things without appearing to travel to get there. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I think, too." Dale Whitmore arrived at 8:53 on Saturday morning in a sensible four-door sedan loaded with 2 bags of equipment and the particular energized quietness of a man who had been thinking hard about something for 48 hours. He was 61, heavy-set, with reading glasses he kept losing on top of his head, and he had the kind of professional authority that didn't require him to perform it. Landon pulled the drop cloth off the dragster without preamble. Dale stood at the nose of the car and looked at it for a solid 30 seconds without speaking. Then he walked slowly along the driver's side, crouched to look at the body forming near the rear wheel arch, stood, and walked around the tail. "Hand-formed," he said. "All of it," Landon confirmed. "Where did you say you found this?" "Beaumont Estate Auction, Fort Worth, listed as non-operational scrap, $500 opening bid." Dale shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, in the kind of controlled astonishment that experienced people allow themselves when the evidence demands it. "Open the engine cover." Landon unlatched it and raised it. Dale leaned in. He didn't speak for almost 2 minutes. He traced the fuel system with one finger without touching it, followed the throttle linkage from the pedal mount to the carburetor, and stopped when he reached the secondary chamber. "There it is," he said very quietly. "You've seen this before?" "I've seen descriptions of it, theoretical diagrams." Dale straightened up and took his reading glasses off his head and put them on, as if that would help him think more clearly. Silas Rowan presented a paper in 1961 at a regional engineering symposium. A very small gathering, not well attended, not well documented. I found it years ago in an archive at the university. Most of the paper was technical notation that the other attendees apparently dismissed as impractical, but the core concept was a secondary combustion feed system using a pre-charged vapor chamber to supplement primary fuel delivery at specific RPM thresholds. He looked at Landon over the tops of his glasses. The idea was that at high load intervals, primary fuel delivery systems have a lag, a brief interval where the combustion cycle is ahead of the fuel supply. Rowan's system was designed to bridge that interval with a secondary charge. More efficient burn, better power delivery, less waste. "That's what I figured," Landon said. "The geometry of the linkage connects to the throttle position. Above a certain angle, the secondary port opens." "You got all that from looking at it?" 3 days of looking at it, and your call on Friday." Dale nodded. He looked at the engine again. "The precision of this fabrication—" He stopped, started again. "Landon, this isn't prototype quality work. This is finished work. This is a man who solved a problem completely, who built a working implementation of a theoretical concept that the automotive industry spent the next 20 years reinventing by different routes." He paused. "Do you know how the modern variable valve timing systems in production engines work?" "Different mechanism, same principle." "Exactly, same principle. Filed as original patents by major manufacturers starting in the early 1980s. Dale looked at the secondary chamber. If Rowan's paper had been taken seriously in 1961, if this engine had been properly documented and the system patented, someone would have had to license it, Landon said. Every performance engine built in the last 40 years would have had to license it. Dale removed his glasses again. Somebody stood to lose a great deal of money if Silas Rowan's work ever got properly recognized. The shop was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, and a dog barked twice and stopped. Landon said, Carter Briggs died in a workshop fire in 1965. Cause undetermined. Dale said nothing. 2 years after the trade magazine piece. 2 years after someone came to buy the technology and they said no. Landon looked at the car. And this car ended up in a junk lot 60 years later with a fake listing and a $500 price tag, as if someone wanted it to stay buried without the risk of actually destroying it. Dale put his glasses in his shirt pocket. Where's the component, the engraved one? Landon went to the locked cabinet on the back wall and retrieved the oilcloth package. He set it on the workbench and unwrapped it. Dale picked it up with both hands and examined it under the work light, turning it slowly. This is from the throttle system, the primary articulation hub, Landon said. It's the part the whole linkage geometry depends on. Without it, the secondary system doesn't function correctly. So someone removed it. Someone removed it, wrapped it, and hid it under the driver's seat. Landon crossed his arms. Which means someone who knew exactly what it was and what it did took deliberate steps to disable the system without removing it from the car. Why not destroy it? Because they couldn't. Not this part. Landon looked at the component. Whoever built this, Rowan built this. This is the core of everything he designed. You can't just make another one, not without the original specifications. Even with the specifications, the tolerances on this machining are extraordinary. If this component is destroyed, the system is gone permanently. So instead of destroying it, they hit it with the car. Dale set the component down carefully and buried the car where nobody would find it for 60 years. They stood there with that for a moment. Dale, Landon said, is Silas Rowan still alive? Dale thought about it. If he was in his late 20s, early 30s in 1961, he'd be in his 90s now, or close. A pause. It's possible. People live a long time sometimes. I need to find him. That might not be easy. If he's alive, he's been quiet a very long time. Dale looked at Landon. And if whoever buried this car buried it for the reasons we're both thinking, the fact that you found it and started making noise about it. I haven't made any noise, Landon said, except for the auction. That was a lot of noise, Landon. 500 people were there. Landon thought about the assistant photographing his registration paperwork. He thought about Vivienne Sterling's locked expression. Yeah, he said, I know. Dale stayed for 4 hours. He photographed the engine extensively with the camera he'd brought, made detailed measurements of the secondary chamber and linkage geometry, and filled half a yellow legal pad with notes in the cramped handwriting of someone who had been writing fast thoughts down for decades. Before he left, he stopped in the shop doorway with his bags over his shoulder. Landon, be careful with this. I'm a mechanic in Mineral Wells. You're a mechanic in Mineral Wells who just publicly started a car that's been dead for 60 years at an auction attended by Vivienne Sterling. Dale's voice was level, but not casual. Sterling Automotive's core fuel delivery patents, the ones that built the foundation of the company before the Sterling family expanded into luxury manufacturing, date from the mid-1960s. Which is interesting timing, if you're thinking about timing. Landon looked at him. That's a significant thing to say. I'm not saying anything, Dale said. I'm noting timing. You draw your own conclusions. He paused. But draw them quietly, and don't leave that component where anyone can access it. He left. Landon stood in the empty shop with the dragster under its drop cloth, and the engraved aluminum component on the workbench, and the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something very large without being able to see the bottom of it. He picked up his phone and started looking for Silas Rowan. It took him 11 days. Not 11 days of constant searching. 11 days during which he searched in the margins of actual work, between an engine rebuild on a '98 Silverado and a brake job on a minivan, and the ongoing effort to keep the shop's accounts in a shape that didn't require him to make difficult phone calls to vendors. 11 days of dead ends in public records, obituary archives, racing circuit documentation, and Social Security death index searches that came up empty, which was in itself a kind of result. If Silas Rowan wasn't in the death index, he was alive. Alive and invisible, which suggested that being invisible was something he had worked to achieve. The break came from an unexpected direction. Landon had posted in an online forum for vintage racing historians, a small, specific community of people who cared intensely about pre-1970s drag racing in the Southwest, describing the car without mentioning the name or the component, asking whether anyone recognized the construction style. Most responses were guesses. 3 were clearly from people who knew something but preferred to know it privately. The 4th was from a woman who identified herself only as M. Hendricks, who said she had worked for 15 years at the West Texas Motorsports Historical Archive in a volunteer capacity, and that she recognized the body forming from the description. She wrote that she had seen photographs of this car in a private collection donated to the archive in 1989, and that the collection had included personal correspondence that she was not at liberty to share, but which had included a return address. She would not send the address by message. She asked Landon to call her. He called her on a Tuesday night after Ava was asleep. She was 73 years old and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lot of time around documents and had developed a related respect for the weight of specific words. "I've been wondering for a long time," she said, "if someone would eventually find that car." "You knew about it?" "I knew it existed. I didn't know where it was." She paused. "The man who donated the collection to our archive, he asked us not to publicize the contents, just to keep them safe. We honored that request, but he didn't say we couldn't tell someone who was looking with the right questions." "Is he still alive?" A longer pause. "He is. He's 91 years old and he lives in a care facility in Amarillo. He's been there for 4 years. His mind is still very clear." Another pause. "His name is Silas Rowan." Landon sat down on the edge of his workbench. "Does he know the car survived?" he asked. "No," she said. "He believed it was destroyed. He has believed that for 60 years. Landon looked across the shop at the drop cloth, at the shape underneath it that had carried a secret for longer than he'd been alive. The long red body, the hand-formed panels, the engine with its extraordinary hidden system, the empty bracket under the driver's seat where the oilcloth package had waited for someone who knew what they were looking at. "I'd like to go see him," Landon said. "I thought you might," she said. "I'll let him know someone is coming. I think he'll want to be ready." A brief pause that carried something in it. "He's waited a very long time." Outside the shop window, the main street of Mineral Wells was quiet and dark, the way small Texas towns are quiet at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, the specific stillness of a place where people work hard enough that they're genuinely tired by nightfall. Somewhere down the block, a light was still on in the diner, orange and steady through the window glass. Landon sat in the quiet for a while. Then he went upstairs, found the backwards R drawing on the refrigerator, and stood there looking at it for a long moment. The 2 stick figures, the sign, the specific crooked optimism of it, before he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He drove to Amarillo on a Thursday. He'd arranged for Harold Betts's nephew, a 20-year-old kid named Trevor, who was decent with basic repairs and reliable enough to open the shop on time, to cover for 2 days, which was approximately the outer limit of what Landon could delegate before the anxiety of not being there became counterproductive. Ava was staying with Mrs. Delgado, who had by this point become a semi-permanent feature of their logistics, a retired school teacher 2 doors down who seemed to genuinely enjoy having a 9-year-old in her kitchen and who fed Ava considerably better than Landon managed on weekday evenings. He left at 5:30 in the morning before it was fully light. With a thermos of actual coffee and the oilcloth package secured in the lockbox, he'd bolted to the bed of the truck the previous weekend. The lockbox was rated for firearms, which felt like the appropriate level of security for something he'd come to think of as irreplaceable. The drive to Amarillo was 4 hours and 40 minutes across the flat West Texas landscape that didn't offer much to look at, but had a particular quality of openness that Landon had always found easier to think in than anywhere more visually demanding. He went through what he knew, which was substantial. He went through what he didn't know, which was more substantial. By the time the Amarillo skyline appeared on the horizon, modest as skylines go, but real, he had a list of questions for Silas Rowan and the awareness that some of those questions might be ones a 91-year-old man had been carrying for 60 years without anyone to give them to. The care facility was called Caprock Gardens, which was the kind of name that tried hard and landed somewhere between optimistic and clinical. It was a clean, well-maintained place on the west side of the city, single-story with a courtyard in the center that had real grass and several large cottonwood trees that were doing their autumn thing, dropping leaves on the concrete paths. The staff at the front desk were professional and unhurried. A woman named Rosa walked him down a corridor that smelled like disinfectant under something floral and stopped at a door that was slightly ajar. "He's been up since 6, Rosa said quietly. "He asked for his coffee early." She looked at Landon with the particular expression of someone who cares for very old people and has learned to read rooms carefully. "He doesn't get many visitors. His daughter comes once a month from Lubbock, but otherwise—" She paused. "He's sharp. Don't let the age fool you, but he gets tired after about an hour." "Understood," Landon said. She knocked twice on the open door and leaned in. "Mr. Rowan, your visitor is here." Landon stepped inside. The room was small but not cramped. A single bed, a recliner, a small television that was off, and a window that faced the courtyard and the cottonwoods. The walls had photographs. Not many, but placed with the deliberateness of a person who had edited their memories down to what mattered most. A black and white image of two men in front of a car that Landon recognized immediately, even in the photograph's era. A landscape that looked like high desert. A woman who might have been a wife, might have been a sister, might have been someone entirely different. The photo was old enough and the quality soft enough that it was hard to say. Silas Rowan was sitting in the recliner. He was 91, and 91 looked different on different people. On Silas Rowan, it looked like a man who had been reduced by time to the most essential version of himself, the non-essential parts stripped away until what remained was very concentrated. He was thin, with hands that had once been a working man's hands, and still held the architecture of that even through the skin that had gone papery and loose. His eyes were brown and clear, and they fixed on Landon with an immediacy that had nothing elderly about it. "You're the mechanic," Silas said. His voice was rougher than Landon had expected. A West Texas voice worn smooth in some places and rough in others, like a road that had been repaired a dozen times. "Landon Pierce." He crossed the room and offered his hand. Silas took it. Firm grip, brief. The handshake of someone who had shaken a lot of hands and didn't feel the need to perform the gesture. "Sit down," Silas said, nodding toward a straight-back chair near the window. "Rosa puts that chair there for when my daughter visits. You can use it." Landon sat. Silas looked at him for a moment. "Margaret, the woman at the archive, she said you found the Phantom." "I don't know if that's its name," Landon said. "I've been calling it the dragster." "The Crimson Phantom." Silas said the name flatly, without ceremony. "That's what Carter called it. I thought it was too dramatic. But Carter had a sense of theater and I didn't, so I let him name it." A pause. "Where did you find it?" "Beaumont Estate Auction, Fort Worth, 6 weeks ago." Something moved in the old man's face. Not a dramatic shift, just a small settling, like something that had been held in tension for a very long time, releasing a fraction of its weight. "They sold it. Listed as non-operational junk. $500 opening bid. They didn't destroy it." Silas said this slowly, as if testing the words to see if they held. "All this time I believed they'd destroyed it. I watched the workshop burn, and I thought—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "I spent 60 years believing it was gone." Landon said carefully. "It wasn't gone. But someone did remove the primary throttle component and hide it under the driver's seat. Without it, the secondary system doesn't function. I had to find the component to start the engine." Silas was very still. "You started it." "At the auction, yes." The old man looked out the window at the cottonwood trees for a long moment. A leaf fell, unhurried, from the nearest branch and settled on the path below. "How did it sound?" he asked, and his voice had something different in it now, stripped of the controlled flatness, and what was underneath it was naked in the way that very old grief is naked when it surfaces after decades of being managed. Landon thought about the sound that had hit 500 people in their chests in that tent in Fort Worth, the deep, ragged roar of an engine waking from a 60-year silence. "Like it meant it," he said. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He put one hand over his mouth for a moment and looked at the courtyard, and Landon gave him the silence he needed without trying to fill it. After a while, Silas lowered his hand. "You came because of the name on the component." "I came because I needed to understand what I found," Landon said, "and because you built something that nobody has ever given you credit for." The old man looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "Credit," he said, with a flatness that wasn't bitterness exactly, but was adjacent to it. "That's a polite way to put it." He adjusted himself in the recliner, and the motion reminded Landon that the man was 91 and had presumably been sitting with this story long enough that it had become part of his posture. What do you know already? I know about the 1961 symposium, the secondary induction paper. I know you and Carter Briggs refused to sell the technology. I know there was a fire in 1965 at your workshop outside of Odessa. I know Carter Briggs died in that fire. Landon paused. I know that Sterling Automotive's foundational patents on fuel delivery systems were filed in 1965 and 1966. And I know that Vivienne Sterling recognized your name immediately when I held up the component at the auction. She went very still. Silas was watching him through all of this with an expression that was careful and tired and something else. Something that looked like the recognition of being finally, precisely understood. Her grandfather, Silas said, Edmund Sterling. He said the name without volume, the way you say a name you've said 10,000 times in private. He came to us first in 1962. Very polished man, good shoes, the kind of man who's been rich long enough that he doesn't need to act like it. A pause. He wanted the system. Not to license it, to own it, all of it. The design, the prototypes, the documentation, the patents we'd filed provisionally. Silas's hand settled in his lap. We said no. Carter said no first, and then I said no, and we both meant it. We'd spent 6 years building that system. It wasn't a product to us. It was the thing we'd set out to do. You don't sell the thing you set out to do. What happened after you refused? He came back twice more. Different offers. The second time he brought a lawyer. The third time he brought a number so large that Carter and I didn't talk to each other for 2 days because we were both trying to figure out if we were fools for saying no. A pause. We said no. And then Edmund Sterling stopped coming. And then the fire. Silas nodded once. October of '65. A Saturday. I wasn't at the workshop. I'd gone to Midland for parts. Carter was working alone. He stopped. When he continued, his voice was level with the specific levelness of a story that has been told internally. So many times, it's worn its emotion smooth. By the time I got back, there was nothing left. The building, the primary documentation, the spare components, the provisional patent files, all of it, and Carter. The room was very quiet. The investigators said undetermined cause, Landon said. Undetermined. Yes. The word carried 60 years of what Silas Rowan thought about that determination. Edmund Sterling expressed his condolences personally, sent a card. He looked at the wall with the photographs. A card. Landon looked at the photograph of the two men in front of the car. The one he recognized as the Crimson Phantom, younger and more vivid, sitting in what must have been the workshop. The one that didn't exist anymore. He could make out, even in the old black and white image, the quality of the car's body forming. And he could see the two men clearly, one of them taller, with a wide grin and a cigarette behind his ear, who must have been Carter Briggs, and the other, shorter, standing with his arms crossed, and a more private smile, who was looking at the car rather than the camera. The Phantom survived because you'd taken it out of the workshop, Landon said, before the fire. 3 weeks before. We'd been running it at a private track outside of Pecos, trying to get clean timing data on the secondary system at extended high RPM intervals. We'd left it there. We were going to bring it back the following week. Silas paused. After the fire, I went back to Pecos. I took the throttle hub off the secondary linkage, that's the component with my name, and I hid it under the seat and I drove the car to a storage facility in El Paso under a name that wasn't mine and paid 2 years in advance in cash and drove home and didn't go back. Why keep the car at all? The old man was quiet for a moment. Because it was Carter's car as much as mine. Because I couldn't watch it get destroyed too. He looked at his hands. And because some part of me, the part that was still an engineer even when everything else had stopped working, knew that if the car survived, the truth survived. Even if nobody ever found it, even if I never told anyone. He paused. Which I didn't. I left the state the following year, changed my professional trajectory, became invisible. He almost smiled at that, a slight wry movement. It wasn't hard. People stopped looking for a man who's decided to stop being found. But you donated the collection to the archive. In 1989. I was 64. My wife had just died. I was trying to... Organize things. He looked at the photograph of the woman on his wall. I kept everything I could document. Correspondence, technical notes, photographs. Gave it to Margaret's archive because they were trustworthy and obscure, and because I needed it to be somewhere safe that wasn't under my direct custody. A pause. I told myself it was enough, that someone would find it eventually if they were looking hard enough. Mr. Rowan, Landon leaned forward slightly. I need to show you something. He'd brought the oilcloth package in his jacket. He retrieved it carefully and unwrapped it on the arm of the chair and held the throttle component up so the light from the window fell on it. Silas Rowan looked at it. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He looked at the component with its engraved name and its two overlapping circles and its precisely machined surfaces, and something happened in his face that was nothing like what Landon had expected. He'd expected emotion, grief, relief, anger, something recognizable. What he saw instead was a man looking at an object that had been part of his body for decades before being amputated, and experiencing the complicated shock of its return. The other circle, Landon said quietly. The R on the right. Was that Carter's? Briggs, Silas said in a voice that was barely above speaking. Carter Briggs. S for Silas, R for our last initials of our last names. He paused. We designed the component together. The system was mine in concept, but the implementation, the specific geometry of the linkage, the tolerances on the secondary chamber, that was both of us. We argued about that linkage for 4 months. He reached out and touched the surface of the component with one finger, a brief contact, and withdrew his hand. He kept saying the third pivot point was unnecessary. I kept saying it was essential. Turned out we were both right in different ways, which was the most Carter answer possible. Landon said nothing. He held the component and let the old man have the silence. After a while, Silas said, The Sterling patents. Dale Whitmore. He's an automotive engineering professor at A&M. He confirmed that Sterling's foundational fuel delivery patents from 65 and 66 are built on the same core principle as your system, not a coincidental parallel. The architecture is derivative. Derivative, Silas said with that same flat precision. That's also a polite way to put it. He looked out at the cottonwoods. Edmund Sterling died in 1987. I read his obituary 3 times. I don't know what I felt. Something that wasn't grief and wasn't satisfaction. He paused. His granddaughter runs the company now. Vivienne Sterling, yes. What does she know? Landon considered the question carefully. That's what I've been trying to determine. She recognized your name immediately. Her reaction told me she has some knowledge of the history. Whether she knows the full extent? He paused. She's been trying to reach me. Her people have contacted me 3 times since the auction. 2 formal offers to purchase the car. 1, less formal communication suggesting that I might benefit from understanding the complexity of the legal landscape around antique vehicles with unclear provenance. Silas absorbed this. They want it back. They want it gone, Landon said. There's a difference. He set the component on the arm of the chair. Mr. Rowan, there are documents inside the car, sewn into the base of the driver's seat in a panel I found during the full inspection. I haven't opened the panel yet. I wanted to talk to you first. The old man looked at him. You found the panel. I found it. I didn't open it. Silas was quiet for a moment. There's an inspection report in there, he said finally. Carter's handwriting. A complete technical specification of the system with his notes in the margin. His running argument with my design choices, which he kept in writing because he liked to have a record of being right. There's also correspondence. Letters from Edmund Sterling's company requesting the acquisition, our written refusals. And he stopped. And? Carter wrote a letter the week before the fire. Not to Sterling, not to anyone in the industry. Silas looked at the window. To himself, essentially, or to whoever might find it someday. He wrote down what Edmund Sterling had told him during their last meeting, when Sterling came alone, without the lawyer, and spoke plainly for the first time. A pause. Sterling told Carter what would happen if they continued to refuse. Not as a threat, he said, as information. Silas's voice was steady with the particular steadiness of someone gripping something hard. Carter wrote it down that night. He told me the following morning that he'd written it down and sealed it with the car's documentation. In case. In case, Landon repeated. He had a feeling, Silas said. Carter always had feelings about things, and he was right about most of them. I told him he was being dramatic. He paused. He was not being dramatic. Landon looked at the wall of photographs, at the grinning man with the cigarette behind his ear. I'm going to open the panel, he said. If that documentation says what I think it says, there are people who need to know about it. Lawyers, Silas said, with a tone that suggested lawyers were a necessary and not particularly comfortable species. Journalists, probably, automotive historians, people who track intellectual property and patent fraud. Landon paused. And eventually, Vivienne Sterling herself. Whatever she knows or doesn't know, the company her family built has to answer for what was done. She'll fight it. Probably. The documentation is 60 years old. There'll be legal questions about provenance, admissibility, statutes of limitations. He met the old man's eyes. But Carter was right. He wrote it down. You built the system. The car exists, the component exists, and the documentation exists. A pause. Sterling's patents can be challenged, not easily, but they can be challenged. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. With the directness of a man who didn't have enough time left to allow for indirect questions. You could sell that car tomorrow for more money than your shop makes in 10 years. I've read what it's worth to collectors. The Crimson Phantom, authenticated and restored. Those people would pay extraordinary amounts. I've had offers, Landon said. And I have a 9-year-old daughter who is going to understand the world through what she watches me do in it. He paused. I'm not a complicated man, Mr. Rowan. I fix things. When I find something broken that should be whole, I work on it until it's whole again. He looked at the component on the chair arm. This has been broken for 60 years. Carter Briggs wrote down what happened so that someone would find it someday. I found it. Silas Rowan was quiet for a long time, long enough that Landon wondered if he'd tired him out. Then the old man said, Carter would have liked you. I think I would have liked Carter. Another silence, less weighted. The panel is under the rear bolster of the driver's seat. Carter installed it. He had a cabinet maker's precision about hidden compartments, which was one of his less explicable skills. Thin lip on the left side, spring release. You'll need a 1/4-inch wide flat instrument to get the lip, not a screwdriver. The edge is angled. I'll find it. Be careful with Carter's letter. The paper will be fragile. He paused. Don't let them take the car. I won't. Don't let them make you an offer you'll regret refusing. They'll make it very large and they'll make you feel foolish for saying no, and they'll be very professional about all of it. He looked at the window. Edmund Sterling was very professional about all of it. I'll keep that in mind, Landon said. He stayed for another 40 minutes. They talked about the engine, Silas asking questions about its condition, Landon describing what he'd found and what Dale Whitmore had confirmed, the old man listening with the focused attention of an engineer, hearing a report on his own work and making internal assessments. At one point, Silas described the specific resistance profile the adjustment screw should have at full and partial throttle, and Landon realized he was describing it from direct memory, 60-year-old tactile memory, the kind that lives in the hands rather than the mind and doesn't fully degrade. When Landon stood to leave, Silas looked up at him from the recliner with those clear brown eyes. You said her name, Vivienne Sterling, at the auction. Indirectly, Landon said. She's the one who made the offer. She knew what it was when you started it? I think she suspected when she saw it. I think she knew when she heard the engine. He paused. She knows something, Mr. Rowan. The question is how much she's chosen to know and how much she's chosen to not look at. There's a difference, Silas said. Yes. Edmund Sterling chose not to look at a great many things, the old man said quietly. His company has been built on that choice for 60 years. The question is whether she has the same capacity for selective vision, he paused, or whether she's something different than he was. Landon thought about Vivienne Sterling standing at the auction, the careful locked expression when he'd held up the component, the calculating eyes that moved across rooms totaling the value of everything in them, the woman who had tried to humiliate him in front of 500 people and then honored her promise when she lost. He thought about the 3 contact attempts from her team and the specific wording of the less formal one, which had carried a distinct quality of someone trying to convey a message without being on record as having sent it. "I don't know yet what she is," he said. "I'm not in a hurry to decide." He said goodbye to Silas Rowan, shook his hand again at the door, and walked back down the corridor that smelled of disinfectant under something floral. Rosa was at the nurse's station and gave him a look that asked without words how it had gone. "He's doing well," Landon said. "He seemed more settled when I checked in 20 minutes ago than I've seen him in a while," she said. "He usually falls asleep in the afternoon. I don't think he's going to sleep today." Landon looked back down the corridor. The door to Silas Rowan's room was visible at the end of it, still slightly ajar, the way Rosa had left it. "He's been waiting a long time for someone to find his work," Landon said. "I think he just remembered that it mattered." He drove back to Mineral Wells that afternoon, arriving after dark, and went directly to the back bay of his shop before going upstairs. He turned on the work lights. He removed the drop cloth from the dragster. He found his 1/4-inch wide pry tool, not a screwdriver, the edge was angled, and he crouched beside the driver's seat and found the thin lip on the left side of the rear bolster that Silas had described. He applied gentle pressure at the angled edge. A spring released. A panel the size of a hardcover book swung outward on a hinge that was so precisely fitted it had been invisible in every inspection he'd done. Inside the compartment were 4 items, each wrapped in waxed paper that had yellowed and stiffened with age but held. He removed them with the careful deliberateness he'd used at the auction and laid them on a clean rag on the workbench. The first was a technical document, 12 handwritten pages covered in the dual handwriting of 2 men. Annotation layered on notation like a conversation preserved in ink. The engineering specifications of the Rowan-Briggs secondary induction system, complete and exact. The second was a set of letters, formal correspondence on letterhead from a company called Sterling Industrial Holdings, the predecessor to Sterling Automotive. 3 letters, each requesting the acquisition of the Rowan-Briggs system, each progressively less collaborative in tone. The third was a single handwritten page in a different script than the technical documents, larger, faster, the handwriting of someone writing urgently. At the top, in capital letters, what E. Sterling said, followed by a meticulous account of a conversation. The date was September 12, 1965, 5 weeks before the fire. Landon read it twice. What Edmund Sterling had said, according to Carter Briggs's account, was precise and thorough, and entirely without ambiguity. It described what would be taken, how it would be taken, and the framing of consequences that were presented as natural outcomes rather than deliberate choices. It read like the transcript of a conversation between a man who understood power and a man who was only beginning to. The 4th item was a small, sealed envelope. On the front, in Carter Briggs's handwriting, "For whoever finds this. I hope you're someone worth finding it." Landon sat with the envelope for a moment. Then he set it aside carefully, without opening it. There was a sequence to things, and the sequence wasn't finished yet. He photographed everything on the workbench, all 4 items, front and back, in high resolution. He sent the photographs to a cloud account he'd set up specifically for this purpose, with 2-factor authentication and a backup email that was not his primary one. He had learned, in the 3 weeks since the auction, that a man with $11 in his checking account and a 9-year-old daughter was not a man who could afford to be careless with evidence. Then he placed all 4 items back in the hidden compartment, closed the panel, replaced the drop cloth, and went upstairs. Ava was back from Mrs. Delgado's. She was at the kitchen table with a library book about the moon landing that she'd apparently been reading since she got home, because she had the slightly glazed expression of someone who'd been somewhere else for several hours. "How was it?" she asked, without looking up. "Good. Did you find him?" "Yeah." She looked up now, reading him the way she did. "Was he okay?" Landon thought about a 91-year-old man sitting in a recliner in a room with photographs on the wall, spending 60 years believing the thing he'd built most completely had been destroyed, finding out on a Thursday afternoon that it had survived. "He will be," Landon said. She nodded, satisfied with this, and returned to her book. Landon made coffee he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Carter Briggs writing a letter 5 weeks before a fire to a person he'd never met, in handwriting that was still legible 60 years later, in the hidden compartment of a car that shouldn't have survived. "For whoever finds this. I hope you're someone worth finding it." He thought he understood what that meant. He wasn't entirely sure he was up to it, but he was fairly certain that not being entirely sure was part of what it meant to try. The fourth offer came on a Monday morning, 9 days after Landon returned from Amarillo. It arrived not by phone or email or through the intermediary legal channels that the previous three had used, but in person. A man in a charcoal suit sitting in a rented black sedan parked directly in front of Pierce's garage when Landon opened the shop at 7:45. The man got out when he saw Landon unlock the bay door, and he walked across the street with the unhurried gait of someone who had been waiting and didn't mind that you knew it. He was around 50, with the kind of unremarkable face that suggested it had been cultivated to be unremarkable. He carried a slim leather portfolio and no visible business card until he produced one from his breast pocket with a practiced motion. "Mr. Pierce, my name is Gerald Foss. I represent Sterling Automotive's Legal and Acquisitions Division." Landon looked at the card. Sterling Automotive was printed in the same typeface he'd seen on the company's website. Clean, authoritative, expensive in its simplicity. He handed it back. "I'm not selling," he said. "I haven't made an offer yet," Foss said pleasantly. "Then you drove a long way to have a short conversation." Foss smiled with the patience of a man whose patience was a professional tool. "May I come inside?" Landon considered this for a moment, then stepped back and let him through. He did not offer coffee. He leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed and waited. Foss looked around the shop with the polite neutrality of someone who had been in a lot of different environments and had learned not to telegraph his assessments of them. His eyes went briefly to the covered dragster in the back bay, and then back to Landon with the controlled casualness of someone pretending they hadn't looked. "Ms. Sterling asked me to convey her personal respect for the resourcefulness you demonstrated at the Beaumont Estate auction," Foss began. "That's a long way around to a number," Landon said. "What's the number?" A brief pause. The rhythm disrupted. Foss recalibrated. "Ms. Sterling is prepared to offer $4.2 million for the vehicle, the component, and any associated documentation that may have been discovered during your restoration work." The shop was quiet. Outside, a truck went by on the main street, $4.2 million. Landon had known the offer would be large. He had not fully anticipated what it would feel like to hear a specific number that large spoken aloud in his shop on a Monday morning. It had a physical quality, a weight. The way very large things have weight even when they're abstract. He thought, involuntarily, about Ava's school tuition for a real school, not just the decent public school she attended. About the shop expansion he'd been pricing in the back of his mind for 3 years. About $11 in a checking account. He kept his face level. "The documentation isn't for sale," he said. Foss's expression shifted by a small, controlled degree. "The offer encompasses—" "I heard what it encompasses." Landon looked at him directly. "The documentation specifically is not for sale. Not at 4.2, not at any number. And I think you and Ms. Sterling both know why." A longer pause this time. Foss set his portfolio on the corner of the workbench. Not opening it, just setting it down. A small repositioning that suggested the conversation had moved into different territory than he'd prepared for. "Mr. Pierce," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. The professional pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned, the way paint thins when you go over it too many times. "I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you're a straightforward person. The documentation you're describing, if it exists, and I'm not confirming that anyone believes it does, would be of very limited legal utility. 60 years of elapsed time creates significant evidentiary challenges. Patent disputes involving material from that era would take years to litigate and would be resisted at every stage with resources that—" He paused. "That would make your position very difficult." "That sounds like a threat," Landon said. "It's a description of legal reality," Foss said. "Sure." Landon uncrossed his arms and picked up a socket wrench from the bench behind him, not purposefully. Just something to do with his hands. He turned it over once. "Here's my legal reality. The documentation exists. It's been digitally preserved in multiple secure locations. I have a retired professor of automotive engineering at Texas A&M who has independently examined the engine and provided written confirmation of the system's nature and originality. I have a sworn statement from the man who built that engine describing the sequence of events in 1965 in specific detail. And I have Carter Briggs's letter." He set the wrench down. Carter Briggs wrote down what Edmund Sterling said to him 5 weeks before the workshop fire. He wrote it down and sealed it in that car because he had a feeling someone was going to need it someday. He met Foss's eyes. Someone needs it now. The charcoal suit was very still. $4.2 million, Foss said, one more time, with the specific tone of a man making his final argument before he has to go back and report that it didn't work. No, Landon said. Foss picked up his portfolio from the bench. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the professional structure had been largely abandoned, and what was underneath it was more direct and, in its directness, more honest. Ms. Sterling will not let this go quietly, he said. I want you to understand that. Whatever your intentions are, she will respond with the full weight of the company's legal capacity, and that is not a light thing. I know, Landon said. I'd expect anything else to be underestimating the situation. Foss looked at him for a moment with something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. Then he walked out of the shop, across the street, and got back into the black sedan. Landon watched it pull away from the window. He stood there for a minute, then picked up his phone and called Dale Whitmore. They sent someone in person, he said when Dale picked up. $4.2 million, full acquisition, car, component, documentation. What did you say? No. A pause. Landon. I know. $4.2 million is, I know what it is, Dale. Your shop makes what, 60, 70,000 a year in a good year? About that. So you said no to 60 years of income. Approximately. He paused. Are you telling me I should have said yes? Dale was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. I'm telling you that you need a lawyer today, not this week. Today. Because if Vivienne Sterling is sending acquisition people in person, the next thing she sends won't be acquisition people. He was right. Landon knew he was right. The lawyer he found was named Patricia Okafor, and she operated out of a two-person practice in Fort Worth that specialized in intellectual property and what she described, on the phone, as the legal archaeology of buried rights. She was 44, direct to the point of occasional abruptness, and had the manner of someone who had spent her career fighting large entities on behalf of small ones, and had come to regard the disparity in resources as energizing rather than discouraging. She drove to Mineral Wells on Wednesday and spent 6 hours in Landon's shop. She examined the documents from the hidden compartment, wearing cotton gloves, handling each page with the care of someone who understood their evidentiary weight, and read Carter Briggs's letter twice. She examined Dale Whitmore's written analysis. She reviewed Landon's photographic documentation of the engine and the throttle component. She did not speak very much while she was working through all of this, and when she did speak, it was in the form of precise questions that she wrote the answers to on a yellow pad in small, fast print. At the end of 6 hours, she sat at the workbench across from Landon and put her pen down. The statute of limitations question is the first wall, she said. On a straightforward patent infringement claim, we'd be out of time by about 55 years. But this isn't a straightforward patent infringement claim. If Carter Briggs' letter is authenticated, and it will need to be authenticated, which we can do through paper and ink analysis, and potentially through handwriting comparison against other known samples, it describes an act of deliberate criminal suppression of intellectual property, preceded by what is essentially an extortion communication. That's a different legal category. Does that change the timeline? It changes what we're claiming and who we're claiming it against. Sterling Automotive, as an ongoing entity, has continued to benefit from patents that were filed in 1965 and 1966 on the basis of technology that the company's founder obtained through criminal means. The benefit is ongoing. The revenue streams derived from those patents and from the licensed technology that descends from them constitute ongoing unjust enrichment. She picked up her pen again. It's not a simple case. I want to be clear about that. It will be expensive, time-consuming, and the other side will have vastly more resources. But it's not a frivolous case. The documentation is extraordinary. What do we do first? First, we secure everything. Every physical document goes into controlled storage with chain of custody documentation. Every digital copy gets time-stamped and stored with a third-party service whose records would be legally discoverable. Then we contact a forensic document authentication service. I have one I work with in Dallas, and begin the authentication process on the Briggs letter and the Sterling correspondence. She paused. Then we file a formal notice of claim against Sterling Automotive, which will trigger their legal team and at that point things will accelerate significantly. How significantly? She looked at him over the notepad. You're currently an inconvenience to them. Once we file, you become a threat. There's a meaningful difference in how large companies respond to those two things. She paused. Do you have security on this space? I installed a deadbolt on the back bay door. She wrote something on her pad. We'll need more than that. I'm going to recommend a security consultant I work with. His fees are reasonable and his discretion is absolute. She looked at the covered dragster. And the car should be moved to a secured storage facility, not here. This is my shop, which everyone in town knows is your shop, and which has a front bay door that opens onto a public street and a back bay door with a deadbolt you installed yourself. She said this without judgment. The car is the physical evidence. If it's damaged or disappears, it's not going to disappear, Landon said, with more certainty than he entirely felt. No, she said, it's not. Because we're going to make sure of that, starting today. She closed the notepad. I need to ask you something directly. How much pressure can you sustain? Because this is going to get uncomfortable before it gets better. And I need to know if you're in this for the duration or if there's a number at which you'd settle. He thought about Carter Briggs's letter. For whoever finds this. I hope you're someone worth finding it. He thought about Silas Rowan in his recliner, 60 years of believing something precious had been destroyed. He thought about Ava's backwards R sign on the refrigerator drawing, the two stick figures standing in front of what she'd imagined their future looked like. There's no number, he said. She nodded, once, as if this was the answer she'd expected and had needed to verify. Then let's get to work. The pressure began on Friday. It didn't come from Sterling Automotive's legal team. Not yet, not formally. It came in smaller, more ambient ways that were harder to respond to and harder to prove. A review appeared on 3 different platforms simultaneously, giving Pierce's garage 1 star and describing Landon as dishonest and incompetent from accounts that had been created within the previous 48 hours with no prior activity. A phone call came to the shop's business line from a man who said he was from the Texas State Board of Automotive Repair, asking about compliance documentation, and when Landon called the board directly to verify, they had no record of the call. And a black SUV with tinted windows began appearing on the street outside the shop. Not always the same spot, not always the same vehicle if you looked closely, but always within sightline of the front bay door. Landon documented all of it, dates, times, screenshots, notes. Patricia Okafor had told him to document everything, and he had taken that instruction with the same systematic literalism that he applied to mechanical diagnostics. He was not particularly frightened, which surprised him slightly. He thought he should be more frightened than he was. What he felt instead was a clarifying anger, not hot, but present and steady, the kind that doesn't exhaust itself. He told Ava some of it, not all of it. She was 9, and there were things a 9-year-old didn't need to carry. But she was sharp enough to notice the SUV on the street and ask about it, and he had made a decision early in her life that he would not lie to her about things she'd directly observed. Someone is watching the shop, she said. She was at the kitchen table with her homework, and she said it in the flat, evaluating tone she used when she was deciding how to feel about something. For now, he said, it won't last. Why are they watching? Because I found something that belongs to someone else, and I'm trying to give it back to them, and the people who have it don't want to give it back. She thought about this. Like finders keepers, but the wrong way. Exactly like that. Are we safe? He sat down across from her. Yeah, baby, we're safe. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. You're not all the way sure, she said. He didn't insult her by pretending she was wrong. I'm mostly sure. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure the mostly becomes all the way. He paused. If anything ever felt wrong, but if anything happened that scared you and I wasn't there, you go to Mrs. Delgado and you call me. That's the rule. Okay, she said. And then, after a moment, are you going to give up? With the car stuff? No. She nodded slowly. Then she turned back to her homework, and the quiet returned to the kitchen, and Landon sat there for a while with the particular weight of being a parent in the middle of something that was larger than he'd fully anticipated when he'd raised his paddle in an auction tent with $11 in his checking account. The SUV disappeared after 8 days. The fake reviews were flagged and removed. The fraudulent compliance call was documented and forwarded to Patricia, who filed it with the appropriate regulatory body as evidence of harassment. The ambient pressure subsided, which Patricia told him was a standard tactical cycle. Apply pressure, assess the response, determine whether the target is going to fold. He hadn't folded, and whoever was making these decisions had registered that. Now comes the formal phase, she told him on the phone. I filed the notice of claim. Sterling's legal team will have received it by now. You should expect actual lawyers making actual phone calls within the week. I'm ready, he said. You should also know... She paused, which was unusual for her. Patricia Okafor paused when something required careful framing. There's been press contact. 2 automotive journalists have reached out to my office in the last 3 days. I don't know how they got there. Maybe through the auction, maybe through Dale's academic network, possibly through the historical archive in West Texas. I haven't responded, but I want you to think about whether or when you want to have that conversation. Landon thought about it. Not yet, he said. Let the legal process get established first. I don't want this to be a story before it's a case. Agreed. Another pause. There's one more thing. Vivienne Sterling's personal assistant called my office yesterday. Not the acquisitions team, her personal assistant, requesting a private meeting, just you and her. No legal representation on either side. The kitchen was quiet. Landon looked out the window at the street, which was empty of black SUVs and had been for 4 days. Where? He said. Dallas, a private address she provided. Within the next 2 weeks, at your convenience. Patricia's voice was carefully neutral. I want to advise against it, for the record. Meeting without legal representation is, I know the risks, he said. Let me think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. He called Silas Rowan. They'd been speaking twice a week since Amarillo, calls that had started as information exchanges, and had become something less defined but more substantial, the kind of regular contact that happens when 2 people have found a shared frequency and don't fully want to stop. Silas listened to the situation and was quiet for a long time. What do you think she wants? Silas asked. To assess me directly, to understand what I actually intend. Or to make you an offer that doesn't go through her formal channels and therefore doesn't exist in the formal record. Possibly that too. Are you going to go? Landon looked at the back bay of his shop, where the Crimson Phantom waited under its drop cloth in the secured storage unit. Patricia's consultant had helped arrange. The car was no longer at the shop itself, had been moved 3 weeks ago to a climate-controlled facility 40 minutes outside of town, and Landon had not told anyone at all where that facility was except Patricia and Dale. Yeah, he said. I'm going to go. Why? Because I want to look at her when she has to talk to me directly, he said. And because whatever she knows, she's been living with it. People who've been living with something like that for a long time, they're carrying it somewhere. I want to see where. A long pause from Silas. Be careful, he said. Not in the way people say be careful as a pleasantry. In the way the old man said most things. Exactly and specifically, with weight behind each word. I will, Landon said. The address in Dallas was not a corporate building. It was a private residence in the Preston Hollow neighborhood, old money architecture, mature trees, the particular silence of a street where people had enough space between them that they didn't need to hear each other's lives. Landon drove himself in the Chevy pickup, which he was aware looked exactly like what it was in this neighborhood, and parked in the driveway without apology. A woman who was not Vivienne Sterling met him at the door and led him through a house that was furnished with the restraint of someone who had excellent taste and the resources to exercise it without showing off. Through a hallway, past a room where a wall of bookshelves held the kind of collection you actually read rather than display, and into a sitting room at the back that had glass doors to a garden going rust and gold in November light. Vivienne Sterling was already there. She looked different from the auction, not less composed, if anything more so, but it was a different kind of composure. The auction version had been the composure of authority in its natural environment. This was the composure of someone who had prepared carefully for a difficult conversation. She was standing, not seated, which he noted. Mr. Pierce, she said. Thank you for coming. Ms. Sterling. He didn't extend his hand, and neither did she. They stood on opposite sides of a low table with a coffee service on it that neither of them moved toward. You should know, she said. that I asked you here without my legal team's knowledge. What I say in this room is not part of any formal process. I understand that, he said. It also means it's not on record. Correct. Which cuts both ways, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Correct, she said again, and something in her expression shifted slightly, as if this response had confirmed something she'd been assessing. She sat down, then, and nodded toward the chair across from her. He sat. How much do you know, she asked. About your grandfather and Silas Rowan? Almost everything. Carter Briggs wrote it down. She received this without visible reaction, except for a small, slow intake of breath. You've read the letter? Yes. A pause. She looked at the garden through the glass doors. The light was flat and gray, a November sky doing what November skies do in Texas, suggesting winter without committing to it. My grandfather kept records, she said, not because he was sentimental, but because he was meticulous. When he died, the estate included several dozen boxes of documents going back to the 1940s. I was 26. I was trying to understand what I'd inherited and how it worked. She paused. I found documents in 1962 correspondence that referenced the Rowan-Briggs acquisition negotiation. I found subsequent documents from 1965 and 1966 that described a series of decisions made at the company level during that period. What kind of decisions? Landon asked, keeping his voice level. She looked back from the garden. The kind that my grandfather apparently believed were necessary to protect what he was building. The kind that She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was 26. I told myself the documents were ambiguous, that there wasn't enough clear evidence of what they seemed to show, that my job was to run the company forward, not to be responsible for choices made before I was born. But you recognized Silas Rowan's name at the auction. Immediately. And you saw what was in the engine. I heard what was in the engine when you started it, she said. I'd read enough of my grandfather's technical correspondence to understand what that sound meant. She paused. I made the offer to buy it back because I thought... She stopped again. Restarted. I thought if I could acquire the car and whatever documentation had survived, I could control what happened next. I wasn't thinking about Rowan or Briggs or what was right. I was thinking about the company. That's honest, Landon said. She looked at him as if she wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or an indictment. It was neither, particularly. He was just noting the fact. What do you intend to do with the documentation? She asked. Support a legal claim. Get Silas Rowan and Carter Briggs's work acknowledged. Challenge the patents that were built on their system. He paused. And tell the truth about what happened in 1965, as specifically and as publicly as the evidence supports. She was quiet for a moment. The garden light shifted as a cloud moved. That will destroy the company, she said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a flatness that surprised him. Possibly, he said. Or it'll seriously damage it. I don't know. That depends on a lot of factors I can't predict. The company employs 12,000 people, she said. They're not responsible for what my grandfather did. No, he agreed. They're not. And Silas Rowan is 91 years old, she said. Whatever justice looks like at this point, it can't undo 60 years. No, he agreed again. It can't. She looked at him. So why? What does this actually accomplish? He thought about how to answer that without it sounding like a speech, because he hated the way things sounded when they turned into speeches. He thought about Ava saying that being forgotten, without anyone remembering you were forgotten, was the worst kind of being forgotten. He thought about Silas Rowan touching the throttle component with one finger and then withdrawing his hand. Carter Briggs is buried in a grave in Odessa, Texas, he said. He built something extraordinary, and then he died for it, and for 60 years nobody knew his name. Silas Rowan has been alive for 60 years believing the work they did together was gone. The patents your grandfather filed on their system have generated. I don't know the exact figure, but it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars over the lifespan of the company. He paused. That math has a human face on it. I think the truth has to go on the record. Not to destroy 12,000 jobs. The legal remedies for something like this don't work that way, and you know that. But because Carter Briggs wrote a letter and sealed it in that car and asked whoever found it to be someone worth finding it. He looked at her. I'd like to be that person. Vivienne Sterling was very still. She looked at the garden for a long time, long enough that the silence had passed through awkward and come out the other side into something else. Something more honest, maybe, the silence of two people who were done performing for each other. When she turned back, her expression had changed. The controlled composure was still there, but it was holding something different now, something that had been behind it all along and was only now, in this room with no lawyers and no record and no audience, being allowed to be visible. "I've been the final guardian of this secret for 4 years," she said, "since I found those documents at 26. A pause. "That's a long time to carry something you can't put down and can't talk about." "I imagine it is," Landon said. She looked at him with the direct assessment she'd used since the auction, but the calculation in it had changed character. She wasn't totaling the value of what she was looking at anymore. She was deciding something. "What would you need from me," she said slowly, "to make the record complete?" Landon looked at her across the low table with the untouched coffee service. "The internal documents your grandfather kept," he said. "The 1962 negotiation correspondence. The 1965 material. Whatever makes explicit what Carter Briggs described in his letter." He paused. "I have Carter's account of what was said and done. Your grandfather's own records would corroborate it at the source. Providing those documents would be an act of—" She paused, looking for the word. "Confession," he said, "on behalf of your family." She was quiet. In the garden, a bird landed on the fence at the edge of the property and sat there for a moment, then was gone. "I need time," she said. "You've had 4 years," he said. Not cruelly, just factually. She looked at him. Then something shifted in her. He couldn't have described exactly what it was, a settling or a releasing, something that happened beneath the surface of her composure and showed only in the slight change of her shoulders. "I know," she said, and for the first time since he'd met her, at the auction in Fort Worth, in the tent with 500 people, when she'd handed him a microphone and dared him to start a dead car. Vivienne Sterling sounded like someone who was not entirely in control of what happened next. He drove back to Mineral Wells in the dark, and the highway was mostly empty, and the heater in the truck made its familiar sound. And he thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't said, and the specific quality of someone arriving in real time and with real cost, at a decision they'd been avoiding for years. He didn't know what she'd do. He thought he knew. But he'd learned in the last 2 months that the distance between thinking you know something and actually knowing it was where most of the important things happened. He got home at 10:15. Ava had left the kitchen light on for him, which she did when she stayed up reading past when she was supposed to, and then fell asleep and forgot to turn it off. He turned it off, stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, then sat down at the table. He thought about Carter Briggs. He thought about a letter written in fast, urgent handwriting on a September night in 1965. He thought about a car that had spent 60 years in the dark, carrying the truth of what had been done to the men who built it, waiting for someone who knew what they were looking at. And he thought about tomorrow, which was going to be another day of work, and a mortgage payment he needed to cover in a library club on Thursday that he could not be late for again. He sat there in his kitchen in the quiet and the dark, and he was tired in the specific way that comes from doing something harder than you'd expected it to be, and he thought, "I'm still here. The car is still here. The truth is still here." That was enough for tonight. The envelope arrived at Patricia Okafor's office on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Landon's meeting in the Preston Hollow house. Patricia called him at 8:47, which was early for a call that wasn't an emergency, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has just handled something unexpected and is still in the process of deciding what it means. "A courier delivered a sealed package this morning," she said. No sender name on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 sentences, and a USB drive. She paused. The note says, "The attached files are scans of original documents from the Sterling family archive, 1962 through 1966. I am providing these voluntarily and without coercion because they belong to the record. It's signed with a V." Landon sat down on the edge of his workbench. "Have you looked at the files?" he said. "I looked at enough to know what they are," Patricia said. "Landon, these are the originals. Edmund Sterling kept meticulous records, like she said. Acquisition correspondence, internal memos, engineering assessments from 1962 showing that Sterling's own people reviewed the Rowan Briggs system and confirmed its viability. And from 1965, She stopped for a moment. There's an internal memo dated October 3rd, 1965, from Edmund Sterling to the company's head of security, 11 days before the workshop fire. Another pause. It's specific, it's explicit, and it corroborates Carter Briggs's letter in every material detail. The shop was very quiet around him. Through the front window, the main street of Mineral Wells was doing its ordinary morning things. A pickup pulling out of the diner parking lot, a woman walking a dog, the specific unhurried rhythm of a small-town Tuesday. "She did it," he said. "She did it," Patricia confirmed. "Whatever conversation you had with her in Dallas, I don't know what you said, and I'm your lawyer, so I probably should know, but whatever it was, she made a choice." A brief pause. "It's going to cost her significantly. I want you to understand that. These documents don't just support our claim against the patents. The October 3rd memo is potential evidence in a criminal investigation. She knows that." "Yes," Patricia said. "She knows that." He sat with that for a moment. Vivienne Sterling had sent the documents knowing exactly what they contained and exactly what providing them voluntarily would mean for her, for the company, for the family name that had been on buildings and letterheads and patent filings for 60 years. She had been the final guardian of her family's darkest moment, and she had chosen to stop guarding it. He thought about what she'd said in that sitting room with the garden going rust and gold outside. "I've been the final guardian of this secret for 4 years." And then, "I know," said in the voice of someone arriving at a decision that had already been made somewhere beneath the surface and was only now being spoken out loud. "What happens next?" he asked. "Now we file formally," Patricia said, "and I contact a journalist I trust. 2 of them, actually. And I call Dale Whitmore, and you call Silas Rowan." A pause. "This is going to move fast once it starts. Are you ready?" He looked around his shop. The tools on the wall in the order he'd hung them, each one occupying the specific place where he could find it without looking. The oil-stained concrete floor. The framed photograph of Ava from last Easter that he'd put on the shelf above the parts cabinet. Because she'd given it to him in a frame, she'd decorated herself with stickers, and he hadn't had the heart to put it somewhere he wouldn't see it every day. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." He called Silas Rowan that afternoon. He told him about the envelope. He told him about the October 3rd memo. He read him, slowly, the 2 sentences of the handwritten note, and then he told him who V was, in case the old man hadn't already understood. Silas was quiet for a long time after that. "She sent them voluntarily," he said finally. "Yes." Another silence. Then, in a voice that was lower and rougher than usual, "Edmund Sterling sent Carter a card when he died. A condolence card, signed with his full name." A pause. "His granddaughter sent documents that might put her in a criminal proceeding." He went quiet again. When he came back, his voice had stabilized into something that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. "People can go different ways than where they started," he said. "I've lived long enough to see that. It still surprises me." "Does it help?" Landon asked. "Knowing she did this?" A long pause. "It doesn't bring Carter back," the old man said. "Nothing does that. But," he stopped. "I have spent 60 years believing that what we built disappeared without a trace, and that the people responsible for that went on to build an empire on the ashes, and that nobody would ever know the difference. And now—" His voice tightened slightly, the emotion in it controlled by the same precision the man had applied to everything his entire life. "Now the record will say something different. Carter's name will be in the record." He stopped. "That matters. I didn't think it would still matter this much to me. But it does." "It matters," Landon said. "How's the car?" Silas asked after a moment, with the shift in subject of someone who needs to talk about something concrete after something that isn't. "Safe. Climate-controlled storage. I've been doing a slow restoration, cleaning, assessing, not changing anything structural. It's going to take time to do it right." "Don't rush it," Silas said. "Carter never rushed anything mechanical. He'd have opinions about impatience." Landon almost smiled. "I'll take my time." "Good." A pause. "Landon, whatever happens next, I want you to know that you didn't have to do any of this. You could have sold that car the morning after the auction and been done with it." "I know," Landon said. "Most people would have." "Maybe," he said. "I'm not most people. I'm also not a saint. I thought about the money." "I know you did," Silas said, with a dryness that was, for the first time in their conversations, genuinely warm. That's what makes it mean something that you didn't. The formal filing went in on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, two automotive journalists Patricia trusted had received embargoed briefings. By the following Tuesday, the embargo lifted, and the story appeared simultaneously in two publications, one a major national outlet, one a respected industry trade, with the specific coordinated timing of a disclosure that had been planned carefully enough that there was no interval for a counter-narrative to establish itself first. The headline in the national outlet read, "Documents reveal six-decade cover-up behind Sterling Automotive's founding patents." The trade publication ran longer and more technical, walking through the engineering history of the Rowan-Briggs secondary induction system, Dale Whitmore's independent analysis, and the chain of custody of the recovered documentation in detail that left no interpretive room. Landon read both pieces at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning while Ava was still asleep. He read them twice. He was mentioned in both. The single-father mechanic from Mineral Wells who had bought a $500 junk car at auction and then refused to sell it back for $4.2 million. He found the framing slightly uncomfortable in the way that any accurate description of yourself in a public forum is slightly uncomfortable because it flattens the actual experience into a shape that is legible to strangers. What the articles couldn't fully convey was the $11 in the checking account, or the backwards R drawing on the refrigerator, or the specific quality of a cold gas station coffee at 6 in the morning on a Texas highway when you're driving towards something you can't fully explain. What they couldn't convey was Silas Rowan's hand touching the throttle component and then withdrawing, the 60-year-old grief in that brief contact. What they couldn't convey was Carter Briggs's handwriting on a September night in 1965, fast and urgent, and addressed to no one specific, which was another way of saying addressed to everyone. But the record would say what it would say, and the record mattered. And Landon had come to understand that you can't always control the shape a true thing takes when it enters the world. You can only make sure it enters. The investigations moved faster than Patricia had predicted, which she said was unusual and was probably a function of the documentary quality of the evidence. When the paper trail is this clear, institutions that investigate things tend to treat them differently than cases that require reconstruction. The Texas Attorney General's office opened a formal inquiry within 3 weeks of the initial publication. The United States Patent and Trademark Office initiated a review of the Sterling fuel delivery patents. 2 class action suits were filed by automotive manufacturers who had licensed Sterling technology over the preceding 4 decades, arguing unjust enrichment and seeking restitution. Sterling Automotive's board placed the company under independent oversight within the first month. Vivienne Sterling resigned as CEO in a statement that was 3 paragraphs long and that Landon read once. The statement did not apologize for her grandfather's actions in the performed way that corporate statements tend to do. It acknowledged them plainly, used the word criminal without hedging, and accepted personal responsibility for having known about the historical record for 4 years before acting on it. It was, as public statements went, about as honest as public statements got, which was not perfectly honest but was substantially more honest than the alternative she could have chosen. Her legal situation resolved, over the following year, into a supervised cooperation agreement with federal investigators, providing testimony and full access to the Sterling family archive in exchange for a deferred prosecution arrangement. Landon was not directly involved in that process and chose not to follow its details closely. He had done what he could do. The legal system would do what it did. He was more interested in a different question, which was what happened to Silas Rowan. What happened to Silas Rowan was this. The world, which had not known his name for 60 years, learned it all at once and could not stop saying it. The automotive engineering community responded in the specific way that insular professional communities respond when they discover a historical injustice in their own backyard, with a combination of genuine outrage, institutional guilt, and the determined energy of people who want to be on record as caring about the right thing. The Society of Automotive Engineers issued a formal recognition of the Rowan-Briggs secondary induction system as a foundational contribution to performance engineering. 3 universities contacted Silas with requests to archive his papers. 2 engineering schools asked if they could name something after him: a lab, a scholarship, a lecture series. He agreed to the scholarship after thinking about it for a week and specified that it should be named the Rowan-Briggs Engineering Scholarship, not just his name alone. Dale Whitmore drove to Amarillo in February to meet Silas in person. Landon drove up the same day, and the three of them sat in Silas's room at Caprock Gardens. Rosa had brought an extra chair, anticipating this, and talked for 4 hours about engineering and racing and the specific culture of independent mechanics in 1950s West Texas that had produced men who built extraordinary things outside the attention of institutions that would have cared about them if they'd been looking in the right places. Silas was sharper that day than Landon had seen him in any of their conversations. He drew diagrams from memory on a legal pad Dale had brought, explaining the secondary chamber geometry with the precision of a man whose hands remembered things his age couldn't fully diminish. Dale asked questions with the focused attention of a scholar encountering a primary source, and filled pages of his own notes, and at one point said quietly, Silas, this is going to be in textbooks, the actual history, properly documented." And Silas looked at him with those clear brown eyes and said, "It should have been there 40 years ago." And Dale said, "Yes, it should have." And they left it there, which was where it belonged. The Crimson Phantom was authenticated by a panel of automotive historians in March, a formal process that involved 3 independent experts, Dale's analysis, and the recovered documentation, and which concluded with a written determination that the vehicle was the original Rowan Briggs prototype, constructed between 1958 and 1961, and that it represented a singular artifact of American engineering history. The question of what to do with the car was one that Landon had been thinking about since before he drove to Amarillo. He'd thought about it while fixing the fuel line at the auction. He'd thought about it sitting at his kitchen table at midnight with photographs of an engine he couldn't identify. He'd thought about it on the drive home from Amarillo with the lockbox in the truck bed and Silas Rowan's voice in his ears. The answer had been the same every time, which was how he knew it was right. He called Margaret Hendricks at the West Texas Motorsports Historical Archive first, because she deserved to be part of the conversation. Then he called Silas, then Dale, then Patricia for the legal framework. And then he contacted the National Motorsports Heritage Museum in Fort Worth, the one he'd known about because it was 40 miles from where the auction had been held, and he'd driven past the sign on his way back to the highway that October morning. And he told them what he had and what he wanted to do with it. The conversation with the museum's director, a woman named Dr. Connie Marsh, took 2 hours. She was thorough in the specific way that people are thorough when they're trying to ensure they fully understand something they very much want, and she asked questions about provenance and authentication and condition that Landon answered with the documentation Patricia had assembled and the certification from the historical panel. At the end of 2 hours, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mr. Pierce, I want to be direct with you. This is one of the most significant automotive acquisitions this museum has ever been offered. What are your terms?" "One condition," he said. "The car is displayed under both names, Silas Rowan and Carter Briggs. Not the Rowan car, not the Briggs car. Rowan Briggs. Together." A pause. "That's the only condition?" "That's the only condition." "Mr. Pierce," Dr. Marsh said, "we would have agreed to that regardless." The installation was completed in September, 11 months after a single father from Mineral Wells had raised a bitter paddle in an auction tent and changed the trajectory of more lives than he'd known at the time, including his own. They held a small ceremony at the museum on a Thursday afternoon. Deliberately small, because Silas Rowan was 91 and didn't have the energy for a large event, and also, Landon suspected, because the old man was not a person who had ever wanted attention for its own sake, only for what the attention was about. Silas came in a wheelchair that he was visibly annoyed to need, pushed by Rosa from Caprock Gardens, who had asked if she could come and been told yes immediately by everyone involved. He wore a jacket and a bolo tie that he mentioned he hadn't worn since 1987 and that he'd found in the back of his closet that morning. And he had the particular dignity of a man who has lived so long and paid so much that nothing can diminish him anymore. Ava was there. Landon had asked her if she wanted to come, and she had said yes before he finished the sentence, and she had worn her good shoes and a dress she'd chosen herself, and had asked 4 separate times during the drive whether Silas would remember that she was Landon's daughter and not a stranger. He told her the old man had a very good memory. She said she knew, she just wanted to make sure. When they arrived at the museum and Silas saw the car for the first time, restored, not to showroom condition, but to the specific, honest condition of a working machine that had been properly cared for. Its oxidized red paint brought back to a living color without being artificially brightened, its components clean and accurate, the engine visible through a display panel in the hood. When he saw it, he was very still for a long time. He reached out from the wheelchair and put his hand on the nose of the car, flat-palmed, the way you put your hand on something real to verify it. Then Ava, who had been standing beside Landon with the particular stillness of a child who understands that something important is happening and is trying to behave accordingly, took 2 steps forward and stood beside the wheelchair and said to Silas, in the direct, slightly formal voice she used when she was being serious, "My dad said you built this." Silas looked at her. "Carter and I built it," he said. "It took us 3 years." "Did you know it would be this important?" The old man looked at the car. "We knew we'd built something true," he said. "That felt like enough at the time. We didn't know it would take 60 years for anyone to agree." Ava considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a long time to wait," she said. "It is," Silas said. "But here we are." He looked at her. "What's your name?" "Ava Pierce." "Your father is a good mechanic." "I know," she said. "He taught me how to change a tire. And the oil, but I'm not tall enough to reach everything yet." Something happened in Silas Rowan's face that was the most unguarded thing Landon had seen from him in 11 months of conversations. A real, full smile, the kind that takes over the face without permission. "You keep learning," he said. "Don't stop." "I won't," she said, with the certainty of someone who meant it. The dedication panel beside the car read, "Crimson Phantom, 1958 to 1961. Designed and constructed by Silas Rowan and Carter Briggs. A singular achievement of American independent engineering and a testament to the work of 2 men who built something true." Below the text, the symbol they had engraved on the throttle component, 2 overlapping circles, S and R inside them, side by side. Dale Whitmore gave a brief address to the small assembled group, museum staff, a few historians, Patricia Okafor, Margaret Hendricks, who had driven from West Texas and looked exactly like a woman who had spent 15 years protecting documents deserved to look, and 2 journalists who had agreed to keep their cameras quiet during the ceremony itself. Dale spoke about the engineering history, the significance of the system, the 60-year gap in the official record that was now being closed. He was precise and warm and did not oversell anything, which Landon appreciated. Silas did not speak. He had told Landon the week before that he didn't want to give a speech, that speeches were for people who needed to hear themselves talk, and that the car was the speech. Landon had agreed. The car was the speech. Afterward, while the small crowd moved through the museum and the journalists began their quiet work, and Rosa steered Silas's wheelchair toward a chair by the window where the afternoon light was better, Landon stood alone beside the Crimson Phantom for a few minutes. He thought about standing in front of it in an annex tent at a Fort Worth auction, pulling back a dusty tarp, running his hand along a body that had been formed by someone who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right. He thought about the feeling he'd had that he couldn't fully explain, the mechanical intuition, or the stubbornness, or whatever it actually was that had made him raise paddle number 74 in a room full of people with better clothes and more money and the comfortable certainty that they knew what everything was worth. He didn't think of himself as a hero. I was clear-eyed enough to know that he was a man who had found something and been too obstinate to let someone else take it from him, which was not the same thing as heroism and was somewhat more ordinary and also, he suspected, more durable. Heroes required extraordinary qualities. What he needed was mostly stubbornness and the willingness to be uncomfortable for an extended period, both of which he'd had for as long as he could remember. But he thought about Carter Briggs, sealing a letter in a hidden compartment on a September night in 1965, writing it to no one in particular, which was the same as writing it to whoever would eventually read it. "I hope you're someone worth finding it." He thought about what it took to do that, to do the careful, deliberate work of preserving the truth when you had no guarantee that anyone would ever look for it, when the people with the power had already told you clearly what they were willing to do. Carter Briggs had believed, even at the end of something, that the truth had a future. He'd acted on that belief with the same precision he'd applied to the throttle linkage and the secondary chamber geometry and every other problem that required attention and craft and the willingness to do the work properly even when no one was watching. Landon understood that. He understood it as a mechanic and as a father and as a person who had spent his adult life in the unglamorous, necessary work of fixing things that were broken. Not because it was glamorous, but because broken things needed fixing, and he was someone who knew how. The shop in Mineral Wells had changed in the past year, not physically. It was still the two-bay converted garage on the south edge of town, still rented from Harold Betts, who had still not formally acknowledged the adjusted rate. But in the way it existed in the town's attention, people talked about it differently. Kids came in asking questions. A 17-year-old named Marcus had started showing up on Saturday mornings wanting to learn, and Landon had started teaching him the way his father had taught him, which was to put the problem in front of you and work it until it made sense, and then work it again until your hands knew it without your mind having to explain it. He'd been thinking about expansion, not in the way he'd thought about it before, vaguely, as a distant aspiration, but concretely, with actual numbers. The settlement of the patent claims and the unjust enrichment suits had generated, through a legal process Landon mostly left to Patricia, a financial recovery that went to Silas Rowan as the surviving creator of the Rowan-Briggs system, which was exactly where it belonged. What Landon had received from the museum for the donation of the car was enough to repair his checking account and then some, and what he'd received from a documentary production company that had contacted him in March, telling his story, with his approval of the final cut, was enough to begin the expansion he'd been pricing in the back of his mind for 3 years. He was going to build a training program. Not a school exactly, something more specific than that, more hands-on. For young people who were good with their hands and didn't have the money for trade school and didn't have anyone who'd taken the time to show them that mechanical work was a skill that could carry you through a life. He'd talked to Marcus about it, and Marcus had said, "That would be real," which was the highest compliment the 17-year-old applied to anything. He'd talked to Ava about it too, who had said, "You should put the backwards R sign on it." He'd looked at her, and she'd shrugged and said, "The drawing I made you. You kept it on the refrigerator forever. That version of the sign. I think it should be the logo." He hadn't told her that he'd been keeping that drawing in a very specific emotional location for the last year, that it had become, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, the image that represented what he was working toward, the thing that made the abstraction of the future concrete. He hadn't told her that because she was 10 now, and 10-year-olds didn't need to carry the weight of their parents' emotional landscapes. But he'd said, "That's a good idea," and he'd meant it completely. He stood beside the Crimson Phantom in the quiet of the museum while the afternoon stretched on around him, and he thought about all of this without trying to organize it into meaning, just letting it sit the way things sit when they've resolved into something you can live with. Patricia appeared at his elbow. "The journalists want a brief statement from you. 3 minutes, they said. I told them 5, and you'd probably give them 2. "They know me well," he said. "They've done their research." She looked at the car. "You okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." "You look like you're thinking hard about something." "I'm thinking about a man who wrote a letter in 1965 and put it in a car and trusted that somebody would find it eventually." He paused. He didn't know who. He didn't know when. He just trusted that the truth was worth preserving and that someone would eventually come along who thought so too. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "And I think that's the only way truth actually survives," Landon said. "Not because institutions protect it or because power is on its side, but because somebody, somewhere, decides it matters enough to do the work, and does the work, even when there's an easier option." He looked at the car one more time, the restored red paint, the hand-formed panels, the precision of everything about it that had been put there by 2 men who cared too much about doing it right to do it any other way. "Carter Briggs didn't know my name. I didn't know his. But he did his part and left it for me, and I did my part and left it for—" He gestured at the room, the museum, the dedication panel, the symbol of 2 overlapping circles. "This. Whatever comes next." Patricia looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether something was worth commenting on. She decided against it, which was usually a sign that she agreed. 2 minutes with the journalists," she said. "Then I'm taking you and Ava for dinner. Non-negotiable." "Deal," he said. He found Ava near the entrance of the main gallery, standing in front of a display on the history of drag racing that had photographs from the 1950s on large mounted panels. She was studying a photograph of a race car at speed on a salt flat, blurred at the edges from motion, and she had the expression she wore when something was working on her. "Ready?" he said. She turned. "Dad, these guys were going like 200 miles an hour in cars with nothing, no safety stuff, just going." "Different time," he said. "Were they scared?" He thought about that. About what it took to build something you believed in and then drive it as fast as it could go, before airbags and crumple zones and every safety technology that made the risk calculable. About what it took to refuse to sell it to someone who wanted to take it from you, and then sit down and write a letter on the chance that someone might need it 60 years later. "Probably," he said. "They went anyway." She turned back to the photograph for a moment. Then, "I want to learn to drive the Crimson Phantom someday." "It's in a museum now," he said. "I know." A beat. "Someday, though." He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, in her good shoes and her self-chosen dress, standing in a museum where a car that had been buried and forgotten for 60 years now sat in a dedicated gallery under the names of the men who had built it. She had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a way of arriving at the center of things that was entirely her own, and she was going to be fine, more than fine. She was going to be the person that everyone around her was grateful to know. He was going to make mistakes as her father. He already had, and he would continue to, because that was the nature of the work. You tried to do it right, and you got some of it wrong, and you kept going. What he could give her, what he'd tried to give her through all of this, was not a perfect example, but an honest one. A man who found something that mattered and didn't let go of it, even when it cost him things he needed, because the thing that mattered was more important than the cost. A man who believed that doing the work properly, even when no one was watching, even when the easier option was right there, was its own justification. The truth was worth the trouble. That was what Carter Briggs had believed in 1965, sealing his letter in the dark with his precise handwriting and his careful thought and his faith in a person he would never meet. Landon believed it too. "Come on," he said. "We've got dinner with Patricia, and I've got 2 minutes of being on record first." Ava fell into step beside him. "Don't say anything embarrassing," she said. "I'll try." "Last time you did the interview, you said, 'I'm just a mechanic,' and the guy put it in the headline." "That's because it's true." She looked up at him sideways. "It's true, and it's embarrassing, both things." He laughed, a short, real laugh that came out without being constructed, and they walked together through the museum and out into the September afternoon, where the Texas sky was doing its particular evening thing, going wide and orange at the edges, and the air was still warm with the last of the summer that hadn't quite decided to leave. Behind them, in the dedicated gallery, with its new lighting and its dedication panel and its 2 overlapping circles engraved on a throttle component in a display case beside the car, the Crimson Phantom sat in the particular stillness of something that has finally arrived where it was always supposed to be. The record said what it said. The names were in it. The work was documented. The truth had made it through 60 years of deliberate silence and come out the other side into light. Not because power had eventually chosen to honor it, but because a man who knew what he was looking at had reached behind a seat and found what was hidden there, and had decided it was worth the trouble to carry it the rest of the way. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough. End of Part 5. Complete story.